In the fog-choked streets of Victorian London, a chilling conspiracy threatens to topple the empire's economy. When a desperate journalist is poisoned after uncovering the sinister Midnight Syndicate, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson plunge into a deadly game of shadows. A cryptic note, a silver ring with an eerie eye, and whispers of a plot to forge bonds and seize the Bank of England draw them deeper into a web of betrayal. Occult rituals and a traitor within Scotland Yard, racing against time to stop a catastrophic attack. By November 5th, Holmes must outwit a cunning mastermind whose ambition could bring London to its knees. Will his genius unravel the syndicate's secrets before the midnight bell tolls? Chapter 1. The Midnight Whispers. The fog clung to London's cobblestone streets like a jealous lover, wrapping the city in a shroud of damp, grey secrecy. It was late October, and the air carried the sharp bite of approaching winter, mingling with the acrid scent of coal smoke and the faint Thames of the Thames. At 2-1 B Baker Street, the fire in the hearth crackled with a defiant warmth, casting flickering shadows across the cluttered room. Sherlock Holmes sat in his armchair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his grey eyes fixed on the dancing flames as if they held the answers to some unspoken riddle. I, Dr. John Watson, sat opposite him, my notebook open on my lap, though I had long since abandoned my attempt to chronicle our latest case. Holmes had been silent for hours, a statue of contemplation, and I knew better than to disturb him when he was in such a mood. The clock on the mantel struck 11, its chime cutting through the silence like a knife. Holmes stirred his eyes, flicking toward the window where the fog pressed against the glass like a living thing. "Watson," he said abruptly, his voice low and precise, "do you hear that?" I strained my ears, but the only sounds were the distant clatter of a hansom cab and the soft patter of rain against the panes. "I hear nothing unusual," I replied, accustomed to Holmes' uncanny ability to detect what others missed. "Precisely," he said, a faint smile curling his lips. "The absence of sound can be as telling as its presence. The street outside is too quiet for this hour. Something is amiss." Before I could respond, a sharp rap at the door startled me. Mrs. Hudson's voice, tinged with exasperation, called up from the landing. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, there's a gentleman here to see you. He's in a dreadful state, says it's urgent." Holmes' eyes gleamed with sudden interest. "Send him up, Mrs. Hudson," he called, rising from his chair with the fluid grace of a panther. I closed my notebook, sensing that our evening of quiet reflection was about to be shattered. The man who entered was a stranger to me, though his dishevelled appearance suggested he had not come from a place of comfort. He was of middle age, with a thin, angular face framed by a mop of unkempt brown hair streaked with grey. His coat was sodden from the rain, and his hands trembled as he clutched a crumpled hat. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, darted about the room before settling on Holmes with a mixture of desperation and hope. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, his voice hoarse, as if he had been shouting or weeping. "I am he," Holmes replied, gesturing to a chair. "And this is my colleague. Dr. Watson, pray, sit and tell us what brings you here in such distress." The man sank into the chair, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of the world pressed upon them. "My name is Edward Harrow," he began, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I'm a journalist, sir, for the Daily Chronicle. I've stumbled upon something terrible. I didn't know where else to turn." Holmes leaned forward, his gaze sharpening. "Compose yourself, Mr. Harrow, and relate the facts in order. Omit nothing, however trivial it may seem." Harrow took a shuddering breath, his fingers twisting the brim of his hat. "It began 3 nights ago, Mr. Holmes, at the Black Swan Tavern in Whitechapel. I was there to meet a saucer man who claimed to have information about corruption in the city's shipping trade. He never showed, but as I waited, I overheard a conversation at a nearby table. 2 men, cloaked and hooded, speaking in low tones. They mentioned something called the Midnight Syndicate." Holmes' eyebrows lifted slightly, a sign of keen interest. "The Midnight Syndicate," he repeated. "What did they say of it?" "They spoke in riddles, sir, using words I couldn't fully grasp. Something about a grand design and a reckoning at midnight. They mentioned a date, November the 5th, and a place, though I couldn't catch it clearly. I thought at first it was just tavern talk, but there was a menace in there, voices a certainty that chilled me. I tried to follow them when they left, but they vanished into the fog." I glanced at Holmes, expecting him to dismiss the story as the ramblings of an overwrought man, but his expression was one of intense focus. "Go on, Mr. Harrow," he urged. "The next night," Harrow continued, "I returned to the tavern, hoping to learn more. I sat in a corner, pretending to read, but I kept my ears open. Around midnight, I saw one of the men again. He was alone this time, and he met with another figure, a woman, I think, though her face was veiled. They spoke of a plan to bring London to its knees. I heard the word bonds and something about the Bank of England. I swear, Mr. Holmes, it sounded like a plot to ruin the city's economy." Holmes' fingers drummed lightly on the arm of his chair. "Did you see their faces? Any distinguishing marks or habits?" Harrow shook his head. The man wore a cloak with a high collar, and his hat was pulled low. The woman's veil hid her features, but the man had a peculiar ring on his left-hander, silver band with a black stone, shaped like an eye. "I've never seen anything like it." "An eye," Holmes murmured, his gaze distant. "And what did you do after overhearing this second conversation?" "I was foolish, sir," Harrow admitted, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I wrote down what I'd heard, thinking to publish a story in the Chronicle. But yesterday I received this." He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper, which he handed to Holmes with trembling fingers. Holmes unfolded the note and held it to the light. I leaned closer to see. The paper was cheap, the kind used by street vendors, and the message was scrawled in black ink: "Cease your meddling, or the midnight bell tolls for you." Beneath the words was a crude drawing of an eye, identical to the one Harrow had described. "A threat," I said, my medical instincts flaring at the sight of Harrow's pallor. "Mr. Harrow, you look unwell. Have you eaten today?" He waved a hand dismissively. "I've had no appetite, doctor. Not since I realized I was being followed. This morning, as I left my lodgings, I saw a man watching me from across the street. He wore the same kind of cloak as the men in the tavern. I'm certain he's one of them." Holmes folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. "You were right to come to me, Mr. Harrow. This Midnight Syndicate, whatever it may be, poses a serious threat if your account is accurate. But I must ask why. Have you not gone to the police?" Harrow's eyes widened. "The police, sir. I fear they're compromised. One of the men in the tavern mentioned a friend in the yard. I couldn't risk it. You're my only hope." Holmes rose and began pacing the room, his movements swift and purposeful. "Very well. I shall take your case, Mr. Harrow, but I require more information. Describe the tavern, the exact words you overheard, and any other details you recall." "Watson, Fetch my tobacco and the chemical index from the shelf. We may need to analyze this note for traces of its origin. I complied, retrieving the items while Harrow recounted his story in greater detail. He described the Black Swan Tavern as a dimly lit den frequented by dock workers and petty criminals, its air thick with pipe smoke and the stench of stale ale. The men he had overheard spoke in low, cultured tones, at odds with the tavern's rough clientele. Their conversation had been laced with references to the master's will and the hour of reckoning, phrases that suggested a fanatical devotion to their cause as Harrow spoke. Holmes examined the note under a magnifying glass, occasionally interjecting with sharp questions. "The ink is common enough," he muttered, "but the paper bears a faint watermark, a lion's head, barely visible. Watson, make a note to check the stationers in Whitechapel for this brand." I scribbled the instruction, my mind racing with the implications of Harrow's tale. A secret society plotting against London's financial stability was no small matter. The Bank of England was the backbone of the empire's economy, and any attempt to undermine it could have catastrophic consequences. Harrow's voice faltered as he reached the end of his account. His face, already pale, took on a sickly hue, and he clutched at his chest. "Mr. Holmes," he gasped, "I feel unwell." I sprang to his side, my medical training taking over. "Lie back, man," I ordered, loosening his collar. His pulse was rapid and irregular, his skin clammy. "Holmes, he's having some sort of attack." Holmes was at my side in an instant, his keen eyes scanning Harrow's face. "Not an attack." "Watson," he said grimly, "poison. Look at his pupils, dilated, with a faint blue tinge around the lips. Cyanide, or something similar." I cursed under my breath, searching my bag for anything that might counteract the poison, but I knew it was likely too late. Harrow's breathing grew shallow, his eyes glazing over. "The Syndicate," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "They know," with a final, shuddering gasp. Edward Harrow went limp, his head falling back against the chair. I checked his pulse, though I knew what I would find. "He's gone," I said, my voice heavy with frustration. Holmes stood motionless, his face a mask of cold determination. "The Midnight Syndicate has struck first," he said, his voice like steel. "But they have made a grave mistake in crossing my path. Watson, prepare yourself. This case may be one of the most dangerous we have ever faced." I nodded, my heart pounding with a mixture of grief and resolve. Harrow's death was a stark reminder of the stakes we faced. The Midnight Syndicate, whoever they were, had killed to protect their secrets. And now it was up to Holmes to unravel their conspiracy before they could strike again. Holmes moved to the window, staring out into the fog-shrouded street. "We begin at once," he said. "The Black Swan Tavern will be our first stop. If the Syndicate believes they can silence us with fear, they will find Sherlock Holmes a most formidable adversary." I gathered my coat and revolver, knowing that sleep would elude us tonight. The fog seemed to thicken outside, as if conspiring with the Syndicate to cloak their deeds. But I had faith in Holmes' genius, and I knew that no matter how deep the shadows, he would find the truth. The Black Swan Tavern was a squat, grimy building nestled in a narrow alley off Whitechapel Road, its sign, a faded depiction of a swan with a broken neck, swayed in the damp breeze. The hour was nearing midnight, and the streets were nearly deserted, save for a few drunken stragglers and a mangy dog rooting through refuse. Holmes, clad in a rough labourer's coat and cap to blend with the tavern's clientele, led the way, his eyes scanning every detail of the scene. "Stay alert, Watson," he whispered as we approached the door. "We are entering the lion's den. Observe everything, but speak little." I nodded, my hand resting on the revolver in my pocket. The weight of it was a small comfort against the unease that gnawed at me. Harrow's death had shaken me more than I cared to admit, and the thought of facing the syndicate on their own ground filled me with apprehension. Inside, the tavern was as Harrow had described, a dimly lit warren of wooden tables and benches, the air thick with smoke and the reek of cheap gin. A dozen or so patrons hunched over their drinks, their faces shadowed by caps or hoods. The barkeep, a burly man with a scarred face, eyed us warily as we took a table in the corner. Holmes ordered 2 pints of ale, his voice adopting the rough accent of a dock worker. I followed his lead, keeping my head down and my eyes sharp. We sat in silence, listening to the murmur of conversation around us. Most of it was mundane complaints about wages, tales of lost bets, but Holmes' attention was fixed on a table near the back, where 2 men sat in low conversation. One was broad-shouldered, his face obscured by a scarf pulled high. The other was thinner, with a nervous habit of tapping his fingers on the table. Holmes leaned closer to me, his voice barely audible. "The thin one is our man. Note the ring on his left hand." I squinted through the haze and saw it. A silver band with a black stone shaped like an eye. My pulse quickened. "What now?" I whispered. "We listen," Holmes replied, his eyes never leaving the pair, "and we wait for nearly an hour." We sat, nursing our drinks and straining to catch fragments of their conversation. The words were guarded, but I caught mentions of the vault and the fifth. Holmes' expression remained impassive, but I could tell his mind was racing, piecing together the puzzle. Suddenly, the thin man rose, glancing around the tavern. His gaze lingered on us for a moment, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Holmes, however, remained perfectly still, his face a mask of indifference. The man turned away, slipping out a side door into the alley. "Follow me," Holmes said, rising smoothly, "but keep your distance." We slipped out after him, the fog swallowing us as we entered the alley. The man moved quickly, his cloak billowing behind him. Holmes tracked him with the precision of a bloodhound, his steps silent on the wet cobblestones. We followed him through a maze of alleys, the city's underbelly closing in around us. At last, he stopped at a derelict warehouse, its windows boarded and its door secured with a heavy padlock. He glanced around, then produced a key and slipped inside. Holmes waited a moment before approaching the door, examining the lock with a small tool from his pocket. "A simple mechanism," he murmured. "We'll be inside in a moment." Using his picklock, he opened the door with a soft click, and we stepped into the darkness. The air inside was musty, heavy with the scent of mildew and rust. Faint light filtered through cracks in the walls, revealing crates and barrels stacked haphazardly. Holmes moved forward, his senses alert, while I kept my hand on my revolver. A low murmur reached us from deeper within the warehouse. Holmes gestured for silence, leading me toward the sound. We crouched behind a stack of crates, peering through. A gap, in the center of the room, lit by a single lantern, stood a group of cloaked figures. The man with the eye-shaped ring was among them, speaking in hushed tones. "The master has given his orders," he said. "The bonds are nearly ready. By November the 5th, the Bank of England will be ours." Another figure, taller and broader, nodded. "And the others, are they prepared?" "They will be," the first man replied. "The vault is secure, and our friend in the yard ensures no interference. The Midnight Syndicate will rise, and London will fall." I glanced at Holmes, whose eyes gleamed with a fierce intensity. He had heard enough. Silently, he signaled for us to retreat. We slipped back through the warehouse, emerging into the fog once more back at Baker Street. Holmes lit his pipe and paced the room, his mind ablaze with the new information. "The Midnight Syndicate," he said, "is no mere criminal gang. Their plan involves forged bonds, a compromised police officer, and a strike at the heart of the empire's economy. November the 5th is less than 2 weeks away. We have little time. What's our next move?" I asked, my mind still reeling from the night's events. Holmes paused, his pipe sending curls of smoke into the air. We returned to the tavern. "Tomorrow night, but this time we come prepared. The syndicate believes they are untouchable, but they have left a trailer ring, a note, a warehouse. Every clue is a step closer to their undoing." I nodded, though the weight of Horrow's death and the syndicate's audacity pressed heavily upon me. Holmes, however, seemed invigorated, his mind already racing ahead to the next phase of the hunt. As the fire burned low and the fog thickened outside, I knew that this was only the beginning of a battle that would test us to our limits. The following day, Holmes was a whirlwind of activity. He sent telegrams, consulted his vast collection of maps and files, and dispatched his network of informants, the Baker Street irregulars, to scour Whitechapel for information on the syndicate. I, meanwhile, prepared for another night of danger, checking my revolver and ensuring my medical bag was stocked by evening. We were back at the Black Swan Tavern, this time with Holmes in a different disguiser, grizzled sailor with a limp. I played the part of his companion, a down-on-his-luck clerk. The tavern was busier tonight, the air thick with noise and smoke. We took our usual corner table, and Holmes' eyes scanned the room like a hawk's. "There," he whispered, nodding toward a figure in a hooded cloak. It was not the man with the ring, but another, whose posture suggested authority. He sat alone, a glass of untouched whiskey before him, his hands folded in a way that suggested he was waiting. Holmes leaned back, his voice low. "He is a higher-ranking member, Watson. Note the quality of his cloak-fine wool, not the cheap stuff worn by the others. He is here to meet someone." We watched as a second figure approached a woman, her face hidden by a veil. My heart sank as I recalled Harrow's description. She sat opposite the man, and their conversation was too quiet to hear. But Holmes' eyes narrowed as he studied their gestures. "They are discussing the vault," he murmured. "See how she points downward, as if indicating something below ground. The Bank of England, perhaps, or another secure location." Before I could respond, the woman rose abruptly, as if sensing danger. She glanced toward our table, and for a moment I feared we had been recognized. But she turned and left through the same side door as the previous night's quarry. Holmes was on his feet in an instant. "Come, Watson, we cannot lose her." We followed her into the night, the fog thicker than ever. She moved with purpose, her steps quick and silent. Holmes tracked her through the labyrinthian streets, his focus unshakable. At last, she entered a narrow courtyard, where a carriage waited. Before we could approach, the carriage door opened, and a man stepped out, a tall, imposing figure with a silver cane and a face obscured by the brim of his hat. Holmes froze, his hand on my arm. "Stay back," he whispered. "That is no ordinary man." The woman spoke briefly to the man, then climbed into the carriage. As it rattled away, the man turned, and for a fleeting moment I saw his face in the gaslighter, cold, aristocratic countenance, with eyes that seemed to pierce the fog. Then he was gone, vanishing into the shadows. Holmes stood motionless, his expression unreadable. "We are dealing with a mind as sharp as my own," he said at last. "The Midnight Syndicate is led by someone of extraordinary cunning. But no, man is infallible, Watson. We will find him." As we made our way back to Baker Street, the weight of the case settled over me like the fog itself. Harrow's death, the cryptic note, the cloaked figures in the warehouse all pointed to a conspiracy of unprecedented scale. Yet with Holmes at my side, I felt a flicker of hope. The Midnight Syndicate might strike from the shadows, but Sherlock Holmes was a beacon of light, and I knew he would not rest until their secrets were laid bare. The days that followed were a blur of investigation. Holmes pursued every lead with relentless energy, from the watermark on the note to the origins of the eye-shaped ring. He discovered that the ring was a custom piece, crafted by a jeweler in Hatton Garden known for his discretion. The jeweler, when pressed, admitted to making only 3 such rings, all commissioned by a man who paid in cash and gave no name. Meanwhile, the Baker Street irregulars reported sightings of cloaked figures near the Bank of England, and Holmes spent hours poring over maps of the city's underground tunnels, suspecting the syndicate's vault was hidden beneath London's streets. Each clue brought us closer, yet the syndicate remained elusive, their true purpose shrouded in mystery. On the night of November the 2nd, Holmes received a telegram from Inspector Lestrade, requesting his presence at Scotland Yard. A man had been found dead near the Thames, his body bearing the same eye-shaped mark as the ring. Holmes' eyes gleamed as he read the message. "The syndicate is growing careless," he said. "Or perhaps they wish to send a message. Either way, we are closing in." We arrived at the scene, a desolate stretch of riverbank where the fog was so thick I could scarcely see 10 feet ahead. Lestrade greeted us, his face grim. "Another journalist," he said, gesturing to the body. "Found an hour ago. Same symptoms as your man, Harrow poison, likely cyanide." Holmes knelt beside the body, examining it with clinical precision. The man was young, no more than 30, with a notebook clutched in his hand. Holmes pried it open, revealing pages filled with shorthand notes. "He was investigating the syndicate," Holmes said, scanning the pages, "and he paid the price." As we left the riverbank, Holmes was silent, his mind already racing ahead to the next move. I knew that Lucky was on the scent, and nothing would deter him. The Midnight Syndicate had struck again, but their arrogance would be their undoing. Sherlock Holmes was coming for them, and the midnight bell would toll not for us, but for them. Chapter 2. The cryptic note. The fog hung low over Baker Street, curling like a living thing around the gas lamps, their dim glow struggling to pierce the gloom of the late October evening. Inside 2-1B, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering light across the cluttered room. Sherlock Holmes sat in his armchair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his sharp grey eyes fixed on the small, crumpled piece of paper he held. Dr. John Watson, seated opposite, watched his friend with a mixture of curiosity and concern, his medical instincts still unsettled by the events of the previous hour. Mr. Harrow, the journalist who had stumbled into their lives with wild eyes and a tale of conspiracy, lay dead in a guest room upstairs, his body cold from a poison so subtle it had evaded even Holmes' initial scrutiny. The man's final words, muttered in a feverish panic about a midnight syndicate and a plot that threatened London, had ignited Holmes' insatiable curiosity. Now, with Harrow's belongings spread across the table, Holmes was already unraveling the threads of the mystery. Watson shifted in his seat, his gaze drifting to the small pile of items: a worn notebook, a fountain pen, a crumpled handkerchief, and the cryptic note that now held Holmes' attention. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" he asked, his voice low, as if the very walls might carry their words to unseen ears. Holmes did not look up. "Patience, Watson. The truth lies in the details, and this note is a veritable tapestry of them." His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it, a spark of excitement that Watson recognized as the prelude to one of Holmes' relentless pursuits. The note itself was unremarkable at first glance, a scrap of cheap paper, folded tightly, as if its writer had feared its discovery. The handwriting was hurried, the ink smudged in places, and the text was interspersed with strange symbols that seemed to defy meaning. Holmes held it closer to the firelight, his eyes narrowing as he traced the lines with a finger. "It begins with a simple enough phrase," he murmured, half to himself. "The stroke of 12 heralds the fall. A dramatic flourish, but vague. The real substance lies in these." He pointed to a series of symbols: a crescent moon, a crossed dagger, and what appeared to be a broken circle bisected by a line. Below them, a single line of text read, "Warehouse 17, East End, midnight." Watson leaned forward, peering at the note. "A meeting, then? This Midnight Syndicate gathers at a warehouse." "Precisely," Holmes replied, his voice sharp. "But the symbols suggest more than a mere rendezvous. They are a code, Watson, a cipher meant to conceal the true nature of the meeting. The question is, what are they hiding, and from whom?" Holmes rose abruptly, crossing the room to his cluttered bookshelf. He pulled down a worn volume on cryptography, its pages yellowed and dog-eared from frequent use. "The crescent moon is a common enough symbol," he said, flipping through the book with practiced ease. "It often denotes secrecy or the night, a fitting emblem for a group calling itself the Midnight Syndicate. The crossed dagger could imply danger or betrayal, while the broken circle, that is less clear. It may represent disruption, perhaps chaos." Watson frowned. "Chaos? You think this syndicate plans something catastrophic?" Holmes' lips twitched in a faint smile. "Catastrophic is a strong word, Watson, but not inaccurate. Harrow's fear, his poisoning, and this note all point to a scheme of considerable ambition. We must decipher the rest of this code before midnight, or we risk arriving at the warehouse unprepared." The clock on the mantelpiece struck 9, its chimes a quiet reminder of the hours slipping away. Holmes set the cryptography book aside and retrieved a magnifying glass from his desk, examining the note with renewed intensity. Watson, accustomed to his friend's methods, settled back in his chair, content to observe as Holmes' mind worked. For nearly an hour, Holmes muttered to himself, scribbling notes on a pad and occasionally consulting other books in alchemy, heraldry, and even ancient languages. Watson, though no stranger to Holmes' eccentricities, found his friend's focus almost unnerving. The symbols, it seemed, were more than mere decoration. They were a puzzle that demanded solving. At last, Holmes leaned back, a gleam of triumph. "In his eyes, I have it, Watson. The symbols are not arbitrary, they are derived from an old alchemical cipher, used by scholars and secret societies in the 17th century. The crescent moon represents Mercury, the crossed dagger is a variation of the symbol for iron, and the broken circle denotes dissolution, breaking of order." Watson blinked, struggling to follow. And what does that mean for the meeting? It means, Holmes said, rising to his feet, that the Midnight Syndicate is not merely a band of criminals. They are organized, deliberate, and likely well. The reference to the fall suggests a disruption of some established system, perhaps financial, political, or social. Warehouse 17 in the East End is our destination, and we have little time to prepare. Watson stood, his soldier's instincts stirring. Then we should alert Scotland Yard. If this syndicate is as dangerous as you suspect, no. Holmes interrupted, his tone firm. Not yet. Harrow's poisoning suggests the syndicate has eyes and ears beyond our current understanding. We cannot risk alerting them. You and I will investigate alone, at least for now. Watson nodded, though his expression betrayed his unease. Very well, but what about the rest of Harrow's belongings? The notebook, the pen, could they hold more clues? Holmes returned to the table, picking up the notebook. It was a cheap, leather-bound affair, its pages filled with hurried scrawls, notes on stories Harrow had been pursuing, interviews with dock workers, and cryptic references to the syndicate. One page caught Holmes' eye, a list of dates and times, all clustered around midnight, with the word warehouse scrawled repeatedly in the margins. This confirms it, Holmes said, tapping the page. Harrow was tracking the syndicate's movements, likely for weeks. He was close to uncovering their plans, too close, which is why they silenced him. The pen, when examined, revealed a hidden compartment, a clever design that concealed a tiny slip of paper. Holmes extracted it with tweezers, unfolding it to reveal a single word: Regent. Watson frowned. Regent, as in Regent Street, or perhaps a person. Possibly both, Holmes replied, his mind already racing ahead. The East End is a labyrinth of warehouses, many abandoned, but Warehouse 17 is specific. I suspect it lies near the docks, where illicit activities can be concealed under cover of darkness. Regent may refer to a street, a ship, or even a code name for a member of the syndicate. We shall know more when we arrive. Holmes glanced at the clock. 10 o'clock. We have 2 hours to prepare. Watson, fetch your revolver and your warmest coat. The docks are cold this time of year. I shall gather a few tools of my own. Watson hesitated, his practical nature warring with his trust in Holmes. Holmes, are you certain we shouldn't involve Lestrade? If this syndicate is as dangerous as you say, danger is precisely why we must tread lightly. Holmes said, his eyes gleaming. The syndicate expects us to be predictable, to call in the yard and make a show of force. We shall do the opposite. Subtlety, Watson, is our greatest weapon tonight. With that, Holmes swept out of the room, his energy infectious. Watson retrieved his revolver from the drawer, checking its chambers with the practiced ease of a man who had faced danger before. He donned his heavy coat and scarf, steeling himself for the night ahead. The fog outside seemed to thicken, as if conspiring with the syndicate to shroud their secrets. By 10:30, Holmes and Watson were ready. Holmes had donned a dark overcoat and a cap pulled low over his eyes, his satchel filled with tools, a lockpick, a small lantern, and a notebook for recording observations. Watson, ever the soldier, carried his revolver and a pocket knife, his jaw set with determination. They stepped into the fog, the streets of London eerily quiet save for the occasional clatter of a hansom cab or the distant cry of a night watchman. Holmes led the way, his stride purposeful, his mind already mapping the route to the East End. Watson followed, his thoughts a mix of apprehension and excitement. He had seen Holmes unravel mysteries before, but something about this, Case the death of Harrow, the cryptic note, the shadowy syndicate felt different, more sinister. The journey to the East End was uneventful but tense. The fog grew denser. As they approached the docks, the air thick with the smell of salt and tar. Warehouses loomed like silent sentinels, their windows dark and uninviting. Holmes consulted a mental map of the area, his knowledge of London's geography rivaling that of any cabman. Warehouse 17 should be just beyond this street, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the lapping of the Thames. They turned a corner, and there it was, a squat, dilapidated building with a rusted sign reading 17. The windows were boarded, but a faint light flickered through the cracks, suggesting activity within. Holmes motioned for Watson to stay low, and they crept closer, their footsteps muffled by the fog. Holmes paused at a side door, examining the lock. "A simple pin tumbler," he murmured, producing his lockpick. Within moments, the door clicked open, revealing a dark, musty interior. The air inside was heavy with the scent of oil and damp wood, and the faint sound of voices echoed from deeper within. Holmes and Watson moved silently, their eyes adjusting to the dim light. They followed a narrow corridor to a large open space, where crates and barrels were stacked haphazardly. At the far end, a group of cloaked figures stood in a circle, their voices low but urgent. Holmes gestured for Watson to take cover behind a crate, and they listened intently. "The bonds must be ready by the gala," one voice said, sharp and authoritative. "The investors will not suspect until it's too late." Another voice, softer but tinged with nervousness, replied, "But what of the banker? Baxter's disappearance will draw attention." "Baxter is handled," the first voice snapped. "He was a means to an end. The syndicate's plan will not falter." Holmes' eyes narrowed, and he exchanged a glance with Watson. The mention of Baxter, a name from the torn ledger, confirmed that they were on the right track. But the talk of bonds and a gala suggested a scheme far larger than a simple robbery. Holmes leaned closer, straining to hear more, when a floorboard creaked beneath Watson's foot. The voices stopped abruptly. A figure turned, his face obscured by a hood, and called out, "Who's there?" Holmes grabbed Watson's arm, pulling him toward the shadows. "Move, Watson," he hissed. They darted through the maze of crates, the sound of footsteps pursuing them. A shout rang out, followed by the unmistakable click of a pistol being cocked. They reached the side door just as a shot rang out, splintering the wood above their heads. Holmes pushed Watson through the doorway and slammed it shut, jamming the lock with a piece of wire from his satchel. They ran into the fog, the shouts of their pursuers fading as they wove through the narrow alleys of the East End, when they were certain they had lost their pursuers. Holmes and Watson paused in a dark alley, catching their breath. Heart pounded, but Holmes was already analyzing the encounter. "We have confirmed the syndicate's existence and their intent to use forged bonds," he said, his voice steady. "The mention of a gala and Sir Reginald Baxter's disappearance are our next leads. But we must be cautious. The syndicate is watching, and they are ruthless." Watson nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "What now, Holmes?" "Now," Holmes said, his eyes glinting in the dark, "we return to Baker Street and prepare for the next move. The game is afoot, Watson, and it is a dangerous one." The fog closed around them as they made their way back, the cryptic note burning in Holmes' pocket like a beacon. The Midnight Syndicate was real, and their plan was in motion. Holmes knew that every hour counted, and he would not rest until the conspiracy was exposed. Back at 2-1B, Holmes spread the torn ledger and the cryptic note on the table, his mind racing. The ledger contained names prominent citizens, bankers, politicians each, marked with symbols similar to those on the note. Holmes cross-referenced them with Harrow's notebook, noting patterns and connections. One name stood out: Sir Reginald Baxter, the banker mentioned in the warehouse. His disappearance was no coincidence. It was a piece of the syndicate's. Puzzled, Holmes spent the early hours of the morning poring over maps of London, pinpointing possible locations for the gala mentioned in the warehouse. The word Regent nagged at him. Regent Street was a possibility, but so was Regent's Park, or even a ship docked at the Thames. He made a mental note to investigate Baxter's connections, suspecting the banker's role in the syndicate was not voluntary. Watson, meanwhile, tended to the practicalities, brewing tea, checking his revolver, and ensuring their disguises were ready for the next infiltration. He marveled at Holmes' ability to focus, even after their narrow escape. "Do you ever sleep, Holmes?" he asked, half in jest. "Sleep is for those with no mysteries to solve," Holmes replied, though his tone was lighter than usual. "Rest assured, Watson, we shall have our answers soon enough." By dawn, Holmes had a plan. They would visit Baxter's mansion under the guise of concerned acquaintances, seeking clues to his disappearance. The ledger, the note, and the overheard conversation all pointed to a conspiracy that reached far beyond the East End. The Midnight Syndicate was no ordinary criminal organization. It was a shadow cast across London's elite, and Holmes was determined to drag it into the light. The streets of London were waking as Holmes and Watson set out, the fog lifting to reveal a city unaware of the danger lurking within. Holmes' mind was a whirl of deductions, each clue a thread in a tapestry he was only beginning to unravel. The cryptic note had given them a starting point, but the path ahead was fraught with peril. The Midnight Syndicate was watching, and Holmes knew they would strike again. Chapter 3. Shadows in the Docks. The fog hung heavy over London's East End, a dense, choking shroud that seemed to swallow the city whole. It was the kind of night where the gaslights flickered like dying stars, their feeble glow barely piercing the miasma that clung to the cobblestones. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson moved silently through the labyrinthine alleys, their footsteps muffled by the damp air. The cryptic note found among Mr. Harrow's belongings had led them here, to an abandoned warehouse in the heart of the docks, where the whispers of the Midnight Syndicate were said to converge at the stroke of 12. Holmes, clad in a dark overcoat that blended with the shadows, paused at the corner of a narrow street, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. His lean frame was taut with anticipation, his mind already piecing together the fragments of the puzzle that had begun with Harrow's collapse. Watson, ever the steadfast companion, stood close behind, his service revolver tucked discreetly beneath his coat. The air was thick with the scent of tar, fish, and the faint metallic Thames of the River Thames, its sluggish waters lapping against the nearby wharves. "Watson," Holmes murmured, his voice low and precise, "observe the warehouse ahead. Note the boarded windows, yet the faint flicker of light escaping through the cracks. Someone is inside, and they do not wish to be seen." Watson squinted through the fog, his eyes straining to make out the hulking silhouette of the warehouse. It was a crumbling relic of London's industrial past, its brick walls stained with soot and neglect. The windows, as Holmes had noted, were boarded up, but slivers of light danced through the gaps, betraying the presence of life within. "A meeting, then," Watson whispered, his breath forming small clouds in the chill air. "Precisely," Holmes replied, his lips curling into a faint smile. "The note spoke of a gathering at midnight, and the hour approaches. we must proceed with utmost caution. The Midnight Syndicate, if Harrow's fears are justified, is no mere band of petty criminals. Their secrecy suggests a purpose far grander, far more dangerous. Holmes led the way, moving with the grace of a panther, his steps deliberate and silent. Watson followed, his heart pounding with a mix of apprehension and excitement. The docks were no stranger to illicit activity, but the cryptic nature of the note, with its strange symbols and veiled references, hinted at something far beyond the usual smuggling or thievery that plagued the area. The very name Midnight Syndicate carried an air of menace, as though it were a spectre looming over the city. They reached the warehouse, its looming bulk casting an oppressive shadow. Holmes paused at a rusted side door, his gloved fingers tracing the edges of the lock. With a deft movement, he produced a small set of lockpicks from his pocket and set to work. The lock yielded with a soft click, and Holmes eased the door open, revealing a dark, cavernous interior. The air inside was stale, heavy with the musty odor of damp wood and decay. The faint glow of lanterns illuminated the far end of the warehouse, where shapes moved in the shadows. Holmes motioned for Watson to follow, and they slipped inside, keeping to the walls. The warehouse was vast, its ceiling supported by iron, beams that groaned faintly under the weight of years. Crates and barrels were stacked haphazardly, creating a maze of obstacles that provided ample cover. Holmes and Watson crept forward, their movements synchronized until they reached a vantage point behind a pile of rotting crates. From there, they could see the source of the light, a circle of lanterns arranged in the center of the warehouse, casting an eerie glow on a group of cloaked figures. There were 7 of them, their faces obscured by hoods, their voices low and urgent. They stood around a rough wooden table, upon which lay a map of London, marked with red ink in patterns that Watson could not decipher from this distance. The figures spoke in hushed tones, their words punctuated by the occasional gesture toward the map. Holmes' eyes narrowed as he strained to catch their conversation, his mind cataloguing every detail. Double quotes, ... The bonds must be in place by the gala, one figure said, his voice deep and resonant, carrying the authority of a leader. The foreign investors will not suspect until it is too late. Agreed, another replied, his tone sharper, almost nervous. But the banker, he's wavering. He fears exposure. Then he must be persuaded, the first figure said coldly, or eliminated. The syndicate cannot afford loose ends. Watson's breath caught in his throat, and he glanced at Holmes, whose expression remained impassive, but whose eyes gleamed with intensity. The mention of a banker named Baxter was a significant clue, tying directly to the torn ledger they had found among Harrow's effects. Holmes' fingers twitched slightly, as though itching to take notes, but he remained still, absorbing every word. The conversation continued, the figures discussing timelines, shipments, and a final act that would bring London to its knees. The words were cryptic, but their intent was clear. The Midnight Syndicate was orchestrating a scheme to destabilize the city's financial system, a plot that could plunge the capital into chaos. Watson's grip on his revolver tightened, his instincts urging him to act, but Holmes' hand on his arm stayed him. Patience, Watson, Holmes whispered, his voice barely audible. We are here to observe, not to intervene, not yet. The meeting dragged on, the cloaked figures growing more animated as they debated logistics. Holmes' keen ears picked up references to forged documents, coded messages, and a network of operatives embedded in the city's institutions. It was a conspiracy of staggering scope, one that reached far beyond the docks and into the very heart of London's power structure. Watson felt a chill that had little to do with the damp air. He had faced danger before, but this was different, a shadowy cabal with ambitions that threatened the stability of the empire itself. As the meeting neared its end, one of the figures produced a small leather-bound book, a ledger, Watson realized, similar to the torn one they had found. The figure opened it, revealing pages filled with names, dates, and figures. He tore out a page, handing it to another member with instructions to deliver it to the contact at the bank. The exchange was brief, but Holmes' eyes followed the torn page with laser-like focus. "We must have that ledger," he murmured to Watson. "It is the key to unraveling this web." Before Watson could respond, a sudden noise, a crate shifting in the darkness, drew the attention of the cloaked figures. One of them, a tall man with a scar visible beneath his hood, snapped his head toward the sound. "Who's there?" he barked, his hand slipping beneath his cloak, no doubt reaching for a weapon. Holmes and Watson froze, their breaths shallow. The warehouse was silent, save for the distant creak of the river against the docks. The scarred man took a step toward their hiding place, his eyes scanning the shadows. Watson's heart pounded, his fingers tightening on the revolver, but Holmes remained calm, his mind racing for a solution. "Stay low," Holmes whispered, his voice steady. He reached into his pocket and produced a small pebble, which he tossed lightly toward the opposite side of the warehouse. The pebble clattered against a crate, drawing the attention of the cloaked figures. The scarred man turned, signaling to his companions, and they moved toward the sound, leaving Holmes and Watson's position undetected. "Now," Holmes said softly, and they slipped from their hiding place, moving swiftly toward the table where the ledger still lay. Holmes' fingers were quick, snatching the torn page that had been left behind. He tucked it into his coat, his movements precise and unhurried despite the danger. Watson marveled at his friend's composure, even as his own pulse raced. They retreated toward the side door, but their escape was not to be so easy. As they neared the exit, the door creaked open, revealing another cloaked figure standing in the doorway. The figure's face was hidden, but his posture suggested surprise, quickly replaced by suspicion. "Intruders," he shouted, drawing a pistol. Holmes reacted instantly, seizing a nearby crate and toppling it into the figure's path. The crate crashed to the ground, splintering and spilling its contents, sold ropes and rusted tools across the floor. The figure stumbled, and Holmes grabbed Watson's arm, pulling him toward a narrow gap between the crates. They squeezed through, emerging into the fog-shrouded alley outside. "Run, Watson," Holmes urged, and they sprinted into the night, the shouts of the syndicate members echoing behind them. The fog was their ally now, cloaking their movements as they wove through the maze of alleys. Watson's lungs burned, but he kept pace with Holmes, who seemed to navigate the labyrinth with an almost supernatural sense of direction. They did not stop until they reached a quiet street several blocks away, where the fog was thinner and the gaslights burned brighter. Watson leaned against a lamppost, catching his breath, while Holmes stood tall, his eyes alight with the thrill of the chase. He produced the torn page from his coat, holding it up to the light. "Well done, Watson," he said, a rare note of approval in his voice. "We have secured a piece of the puzzle, though the picture remains incomplete." Watson, still panting, managed a nod. "What did we learn, Holmes?" "Beyond the fact that these people are dangerous," Holmes' lips quirked in a wry smile, "we have confirmed the existence of the Midnight Syndicate and their intent to destabilize London's financial system. The mention of forged bonds and a gala suggests a targeted strike, likely at a high-profile event. And this, he held up the torn page. This contains names, Watson. Names of those entangled in their web, willingly or otherwise. Sir Reginald Baxter, the banker, is among them, and his role is pivotal. Watson frowned, his mind still reeling from the night's events. But who are they, Holmes? And why such secrecy? If their goal is chaos, why the cloaks and coded messages? Holmes' eyes gleamed with the intensity of a man who saw not just the pieces but the shape of the board itself. That Watson is the heart of the matter. The Midnight Syndicate is no ordinary criminal enterprise. Their methods suggest a deeper purpose, one that transcends mere profit. The symbols, the secrecy, the mention of a final act, all point to an organization with ambitions that may shake the very foundations of our society. They began their walk back to Baker Street, the fog swirling around them like a living thing. The torn page, now safely tucked in Holmes' coat, was a tangible link to the conspiracy, but Watson knew it was only the beginning. The Midnight Syndicate was a shadow cast across London, and Holmes was determined to drag it into the light dot as they moved through the quiet streets. Holmes' mind was already at work, dissecting the night's observations. The cloaked figures, the map, the ledger, the mention of Sir Reginald Baxter were threads in a tapestry of intrigue that he would unravel no matter the cost. Watson, for his part, felt the weight of the danger they faced, but also the unshakable confidence that came from standing beside Sherlock Holmes. The night was far from over, and the game, as Holmes often said, was afoot. Chapter 4. The banker's disappearance. The fog clung to London's streets like a conspirator's cloak, muffling the clatter of hooves and the distant cries of night vendors. Sherlock Holmes sat in the dimly lit sitting room of 221B Baker Street, his sharp eyes fixed on the torn ledger spread across the table, the names scrawled within its pages. Prominent citizens, men of influence seemed to pulse with secrets, and among them one stood out, Sir Reginald Baxter, a banker whose wealth and connections made him a pillar of the city's financial world. Watson, seated opposite, sipped his tea, his brow furrowed as he watched Holmes trace a finger over the jagged edge of the torn page. "Sir Reginald Baxter," Holmes murmured, his voice low, almost reverent, as if invoking the name might summon the man himself, a man of meticulous habits, yet his name appears in this ledger, tied to a shadowy syndicate. "Curious, Watson, don't you think?" "Curious, indeed," Watson replied, setting his cup down. "But why would a man of his stature be involved with such a group? Blackmail, perhaps." Holmes' lips twitched into a faint smile. "Blackmail is a blunt instrument, Watson. The Midnight Syndicate operates with a finesse that suggests something more intricate. We must visit Baxter's mansion. If he is entangled with this group, his home will hold the key." The hansom cab rattled through the gaslit streets, carrying Holmes and Watson toward Kensington, where Baxter's grand residence loomed like a monument to opulence. The mansion's facade was all polished stone and towering windows, but an air of disquiet hung over it. The iron gates were ajar, and no servants greeted them as they approached the heavy oak door. Holmes' keen eyes noted the faint scratches around the lock, recent, deliberate, and not the work of a careless hand. "Someone has been here," Holmes said, his voice barely above a whisper, "and they were not invited." Inside, the mansion was a study in grandeur. Marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors glared down from the walls. Yet the silence was oppressive. broken only by the faint creak of floorboards under their feet. Watson's hand hovered near the revolver in his coat pocket, his soldier's instincts alert. They found the drawing room in disarray. Papers were strewn across a mahogany desk, a glass of brandy lay spilled on the carpet, and a chair was overturned, its velvet cushion slashed. Holmes moved with the precision of a predator, his eyes darting from one detail to the next. He knelt by the desk, examining a smudge of ink on a blotter. "Fresh," he said, rubbing the ink between his fingers. Baxter was writing something before he was interrupted. "Look here, Watson, the ink is still tacky, and the pen is uncapped. He left in haste, or he was taken." Watson scanned the room, his gaze settling on a portrait of Baxter himself, a portly man with mutton chops and a stern expression. "Do you think he's been kidnapped?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. He was already at the fireplace, running his fingers along the mantel. His hand paused at a carved lion's head, and with a gentle twist, a faint click echoed through the room. A panel in the wall slid open, revealing a narrow compartment. Inside was a small iron safe, its door slightly ajar. "Clever," Holmes said, his eyes gleaming, "but not clever enough to hide from me." The safe contained a bundle of documents, tied with a red ribbon. Holmes untied it with care, spreading the papers on the desk. They were financial records ledgers, promissory notes, and what appeared to be drafts of bonds. But as Holmes examined them, his expression darkened. "Forged," he declared, holding up a bond to the light. "The watermark is incorrect, and the ink has a peculiar sheen. These are not the work of the Bank of England. They are counterfeit, Watson, and exquisitely done." Watson leaned closer, squinting at the documents. "Counterfeit bonds. To what end?" "To destabilize," Holmes said, his voice sharp. "A flood of forged bonds could undermine confidence in London's financial system. Banks would falter, investors would panic, and the economy would teeter on the brink. The Midnight Syndicate is not merely a criminal enterprise, aims to strike at the heart of the empire." "But why Baxter?" Watson asked. "If he's a victim, why is his name in their ledger?" Holmes paced the room, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. "That, Watson, is the question. Baxter's wealth and influence make him a valuable alor, a dangerous liability. If he was coerced, there will be evidence of it. Search the room. Look for anything out of place." They combed the mansion, their footsteps echoing in the empty halls. Watson found a locked drawer in Baxter's study, which Holmes opened with a deft twist of a hairpin. Inside were letters, written in a hurried hand, addressed to Baxter. They spoke of debts, threats, and cryptic references to the syndicate's will. One letter, unsigned, bore a single chilling line: "Comply, or your empire falls." "Blackmail, after all," Watson said, his voice grim. "Not blackmail," Holmes corrected. "Coercion with a purpose. These letters suggest Baxter was forced to cooperate, perhaps to provide access to financial networks or to lend legitimacy to the syndicate schemes. But where is he now?" Their search led them to the upstairs bedroom, where the air was heavy with the scent of cigar smoke. Baxter's bed was unmade, the sheets tangled as if he had risen in a hurry. On the nightstand, a half-burned cigar rested. In an ashtray, its ash undisturbed. Holmes picked it up, sniffing it carefully. "An expensive blend," he said, "but laced with something else. A sedative, perhaps." "Baxter was drugged, Watson, and taken from this room." Watson's eyes widened. "Drugged? Then he's not a willing participant." "Not entirely," Holmes said, his gaze distant. But the syndicate's reach is long, and their methods are ruthless. We must find Baxter before they silence him permanently. Their investigation was interrupted by a faint noise from downstairs. Soft thud, like a door closing. Holmes held up a hand, silencing Watson. They crept to the landing, peering into the darkened foyer below. A shadow moved, swift and silent, toward the drawing room. Holmes motioned for Watson to follow, his expression one of intense focus. They descended the stairs, moving with the stealth of hunters. The shadow resolved into a figure, a man, cloaked and hooded, rifling through the papers on Baxter's desk. Holmes stepped forward, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Step away from the desk," he said, "and explain your presence here." The man spun around, his face obscured by the hood. For a moment he froze, then bolted for the door. Holmes was faster, seizing the man's arm and twisting it behind his back. The intruder gasped, struggling, but Holmes held firm. "Who are you?" Holmes demanded. "And what do you seek in Sir Reginald Baxter's home?" The man's voice was low, tinged with fear. "I'm nobody, just a thief, looking for valuables." Holmes' eyes narrowed. "A thief who ignores silver candlesticks and gold watches to rummage through financial documents? I think not. Watson, search him." Watson patted the man down, finding a small knife, a vial of dark liquid, and a folded paper bearing the same symbol Holmes had found in the Leggera circle, bisected by a jagged line. Holmes' grip tightened. "The Midnight Syndicate," he said, his voice cold. "You are one of their agents. Where is Baxter?" The man's eyes darted, seeking escape, but Holmes' hold was unyielding. "I don't know," he stammered. "I was just told to retrieve the papers." "By whom?" Holmes pressed. The man's lips trembled, but before he could speak, a sharp crack echoed through the room. The man slumped forward, a dart protruding from his neck. Holmes released him, spinning to face the open window, but the shooter was already gone. Swallowed by the fog, Watson knelt beside the man, checking his pulse. "Dead," he said grimly, "poisoned like Harrow." Holmes' expression was unreadable as he examined the dart. "A precise weapon, Watson. The syndicate is tying up loose ends. This man was expendable, and Baxter may be next." They searched the body, finding little else of value, but the symbol on the paper burned itself into Holmes' mind. It was no mere coincidence, it was a thread in the web of the Midnight Syndicate, and Holmes was determined to follow it. The next morning, Holmes and Watson returned to Baker Street, the forged bonds and threatening letters spread across the table. Holmes lit his pipe, the smoke curling around him like a shroud. "Baxter's disappearance is no isolated incident," he said. "He is a pawn in a larger game, one that threatens the stability of London itself. We must find the forger responsible for these bonds. They are the key to unraveling the syndicate's plan." Watson nodded, his face set with determination. "Where do we start?" Holmes tapped the ledger, his finger resting on a single word. Scrawled in the margin, "Crow, Elias Crow," he said. "A name I've heard whispered in the underbelly of London's art world. A reclusive forger, skilled enough to craft bonds that could fool even the sharpest banker. If anyone knows the syndicate's next move, it is he." The trail led them to a seedy tavern in Whitechapel, a place where the air was thick with the stench of ale and despair. Holmes donned a disguiser, tattered coat, a slouch hat, and a false beard blending seamlessly into the crowd of dock workers and petty thieves. Watson, less comfortable in such surroundings, kept close, his hand never far from his revolver. Elias Crowe was a wiry man with ink-stained fingers and eyes that darted like a cornered animal's. Holmes approached him under the guise of a disgraced clerk seeking forged documents. Crowe was wary, but Holmes' charm and a few well-placed coins loosened his tongue. "The bonds," Holmes said, leaning close, his voice low. "I hear you're the man to see for work of that quality." Crowe's lips twitched into a smirk. "You've heard wrong, friend. I'm just an artist whose work could bring down banks," Holmes said, his eyes glinting. "Tell me about the Midnight Syndicate. Who do they answer to?" Crowe's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of fear. "You don't know what you're asking," he whispered. "They're everywhere. They see everything. I make what they ask, and I don't ask questions." "Then let me ask one," Holmes said, his voice like steel. "Where is Sir Reginald Baxter?" Crowe hesitated, his fingers trembling on his glass. "I don't know where he is," he said finally, "but I heard them talk. They needed his signature, his seal, to make the bonds legitimate. They took him somewhere. A warehouse, maybe, by the docks." Holmes pressed further, but before Crowe could say more, a shadow fell across the table. A man in a dark coat loomed behind Crowe, his hand moving with lethal speed. A blade flashed, and Crowe slumped forward, blood pooling on the table. The assailant vanished into the crowd before Watson could draw his revolver. Holmes cursed under his breath, checking Crowe's body for clues. Tucked in his pocket was a scrap of paper, bearing the same symbol as before, and a single word, Vaughan, lady. "Eleanor Vaughan," Holmes said, his voice taut with realization. "A name that keeps surfacing. A socialite with connections to the elite. If she is involved, the syndicate's reach is even greater than I feared." They left the tavern, the weight of Crowe's death heavy on their minds. The fog had thickened, cloaking the city in a veil of uncertainty. Holmes' mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. Baxter's disappearance, the forged bonds, the symbol, and now Lady Vaughan were threads in a tapestry of conspiracy, and Holmes was determined to unravel it. Back at Baker Street, Holmes stood before the fireplace, the forged bonds spread before him. "The syndicate is playing a dangerous game," he said. "They have coerced men like Baxter, silenced men like Crowe, and they operate with impunity. But they have made a mistake, Watson. They have left clues, and clues are my currency." Watson, ever the loyal companion, nodded. "What's our next move?" Holmes' eyes gleamed with the fire of the chase. "We follow the symbol. It is no mere mark, is the key to the syndicate's motives, and I suspect it will lead us to Lady Vaughan, and perhaps to Baxter himself. Tomorrow we delve deeper. The game, Watson, is afoot." The night stretched on, and Holmes sat in silence, his mind a whirlwind of deduction. The Midnight Syndicate was a hydra, its heads hidden in the shadows of London's elite. But Holmes was no ordinary hunter. He would cut through the fog, expose the truth, and bring the syndicate to its knees. For now, though the city slept, unaware of the danger lurking in its heart, and Holmes prepared for the battle ahead. Chapter 5. The Trail of the Forger. The fog hung low over London, a thick, choking veil that clung to the cobblestones and blurred the gaslights into hazy orbs. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson moved swiftly through the narrow streets of Whitechapel, their footsteps muffled by the damp air. The revelation of the Midnight Syndicate's audacious plan to flood London with counterfeit bonds had set Holmes' mind ablaze, and now, with a name in hand alias Crow, the forger, he was determined to unravel the next thread of the conspiracy. Holmes had deduced Crow's likely haunt from a scrap of paper found among Sir Reginald Baxter's belongings, a crumpled tavern bill stamped with the faded emblem of the Blackened Anchor, a notorious watering hole in the East End. The establishment was known to shelter the dregs of society thieves, smugglers, and those who thrived in the shadows. If Crow was the syndicate's forger, this was precisely the sort of place he would slink to, hiding his craft among the clamour of tankards and whispered deals. "Holmes," Watson muttered, adjusting his coat against the chill, "are you certain this is wise? We're walking into a den of cutthroats with nothing but your wits and my revolver." Holmes' lips twitched into a faint smile, though his eyes remained sharp, scanning the alley ahead. "Your revolver, Watson, is a fine companion, but I suspect my wits will suffice tonight. Crow is a craftsman, not a brawler. He'll be more inclined to talk than to fight if we approach him correctly." Watson grunted, unconvinced. "And if he's surrounded by syndicate thugs, then we shall improvise," Holmes replied, his tone as casual as if discussing the weather. "But first, we must blend in. Observe." He paused at the mouth of an alley where a pile of discarded rags lay heaped against a wall. With deft movements, Holmes plucked a tattered scarf and a stained cap from the pile, transforming his appearance in moments. He smeared a bit of soot from a nearby lamppost across his face, dulling his sharp features, and adopted a slight slouch. Watson, accustomed to Holmes' penchant for disguise, followed suit, though with less enthusiasm, wrapping a frayed shawl around his shoulders. "Charming," Watson said dryly, glancing at his reflection in a grimy puddle. "I look like a dock worker who's lost a bet." "Precisely the point," Holmes said, adjusting his cap. "Now, keep your eyes open and your hand near your revolver. The Blackened Anchor is not a place for the unwary." The tavern loomed at the end of the street, its cinder-rusted anchor dangling from a creaking chain barely visible through the fog. The windows glowed with a sickly yellow light, and the din of raucous laughter and clinking glasses spilled into the night. Holmes pushed open the door, and a wave of stale beer, tobacco smoke, and unwashed bodies assaulted their senses. Inside, the tavern was a chaotic tableau of vice. Dock workers, sailors, and shifty-eyed men in threadbare coats crowded around scarred wooden tables, their voices a cacophony of slurred boasts and muttered threats. A barmaid with a weary expression navigated the throng, balancing a tray of mugs, while a one-eyed fiddler in the corner scraped out a discordant tune. Holmes' eyes darted across the room, cataloguing every detail. The man in the corner nursing a glass of gin, his fingers stained with ink. The group of sailors playing cards, their knives glinting on the table. The cloaked figure by the fireplace, watching the room with unnatural stillness. Their Holmes whispered, nodding toward a table in the far corner. A wiry man with a shock of greasy black hair sat alone, hunched over a sketchbook. His fingers, stained with charcoal and ink, moved rapidly, sketching intricate designs that Holmes recognized at once as the delicate flourishes of a master forger. Elias Crow. Holmes motioned for Watson to follow, and they wove through the crowd, avoiding the drunken lurches of the patrons. As they approached Crow's table, Holmes adopted a gruff East End accent. "Oi, mate," he said, sliding into the chair opposite Crow. "Heard you're the bloke to see for special work." Crow's hand froze mid-sketch, and his eyes and suspicious flicked up to meet Holmes. He was younger than Watson had expected, perhaps in his late 30s, with a gaunt face and a nervous energy that suggested a man perpetually on edge. "Don't know what you're on about," Crow said, his voice low and clipped. "I'm just here for a drink." Holmes leaned forward, his gaze unyielding. "Come now, Mr. Crow. A man of your talents doesn't sit in a place like this for the ale. I've seen your work. Those bonds are exquisite. The syndicate must pay you handsomely." Crow's eyes widened, and his hand twitched toward a knife tucked into his belt. Watson, ever vigilant, shifted slightly, his hand resting on the revolver, hidden beneath his coat. "Easy, now," Watson said, his voice calm but firm. "We're not here to cause trouble. We just want to talk." Crow's gaze darted between them, his fingers trembling. "You're not syndicate," he said, almost to himself. "Who are you? Coppers? Rivals?" "Neither," Holmes said, his voice softening but retaining its edge. "Let's just say we're interested parties. We know about the Midnight Syndicate, and we know they're planning something big. You're a key piece of that puzzle, Mr. Crow. Help us, and we can protect you." Crow let out a bitter laugh, his eyes glinting, with a mix of fear and defiance. "Protect me? You don't know what you're up against. The syndicate, they're everywhere. They've got eyes in every corner of this city. If I talk, I'm a dead man. Then why stay here?" Holmes pressed, his tone almost conversational. "A man of your skill could disappear Paris, Vienna, even the Americas. Yet you're still in London, skulking in this rat's nest. Why?" Crow's jaw tightened, and for a moment he seemed to wrestle with himself. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because they've got something on me, something I can't run from. If I leave, they'll find her." Watson asked, his brow furrowing. Crow's eyes softened, and for the first time he looked less like a cornered animal and more like a man carrying a heavy burden. "My sister, Clara, she's all I've got left. They know where she is somewhere, in the city, locked away. If I don't do what they say, they'll kill her." Holmes' expression remained impassive, but Watson could see the gears turning in his mind. "And what exactly do they want you to do?" Holmes asked. Crow hesitated, glancing around the tavern as if expecting syndicate enforcers to materialize. "From the shadows, the bonds," he said at last. "They've got me forging government bonds, hundreds of thousands of pounds worth. They're going to flood the market, crash the banks, and bring London to its knees. It's not just about money, it's about power. They want to control everything." Watson felt a chill run down his spine. The scope of the syndicate's plan was staggering, far beyond what they had initially suspected. "Who's behind it?" he asked. "Who's giving the orders?" Crow shook his head, his face pale. "I don't know. They don't tell me names. I get my orders through a middleman, a man called Haraway. He's a copper, but he's one of them. Meets me in secret. Passes me the designs, and makes sure I don't step out of line." Holmes' eyes narrowed at the mention of Haraway. "Constable Haraway, you say? Interesting. And where do you deliver the bonds?" Crow hesitated again, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. "There's a drop pointer warehouse by the docks. I leave the bonds in a crate marked with a symbol, and someone collects them. I never see who." Holmes leaned back, his mind racing. "A symbol, you say? Describe it." Crow's hand moved to his sketchbook, and with a few quick strokes, he drew a strange, intricate design, a circle bisected by a curved line with smaller symbols radiating from its center. "This," he said, sliding the sketch across the table. "It's on everything, notes, crates, even the ledgers." Holmes studied the symbol, his fingers tracing its lines. "Fascinating," he murmured. "An alchemical sigil, perhaps, or something older. Tell me, Mr. Crow, when is your next delivery?" "Tomorrow night," Crow said, his voice barely audible. "Midnight, at the warehouse. But you can't go there, writs crawling with their men. You'll be walking into a trap." Holmes smiled faintly. "Traps, Mr. Crow, are my specialty. Now, one last question. Where is your sister being held?" Crow's face crumpled, and for a moment Watson thought he might weep. "I don't know," he said, his voice breaking. "They move her constantly. All I get are messages notes telling me she's alive, but never where. If I don't do what they say—" His words were cut off by a sudden commotion at the tavern's entrance. The door slammed open, and 3 men in dark coats stormed in, their eyes scanning the room with predatory intent. Crow froze, his face draining of color. "They're here," he whispered. "They know." Holmes reacted instantly, pulling Watson to his feet. "Time to leave," he said, his voice calm but urgent. He grabbed Crow's arm, dragging him toward a side door half hidden behind a stack of barrels. "Move, now." The 3 men pushed through the crowd, their hands slipping beneath their coats as they zeroed in on Crow's table. "Watson!" Heart pounded as he followed Holmes, his hand gripping the revolver. They slipped through the side door into a narrow alley, the fog swallowing them as they ran. "Keep moving," Holmes hissed, leading them through a maze of alleys, Crow stumbling. Behind, the sound of boots echoed in the distance, growing closer. Holmes ducked into a shadowed doorway, pulling Crow and Watson with him. They pressed against the wall, holding their breath as the syndicate men passed by, their voices sharp with frustration. "We've lost them," one of the men growled. "Spread out. They can't have gone far." As the footsteps faded, Holmes turned to Crow, his eyes blazing. "You're coming with us," he said. "If the syndicate is onto you, you're no longer safe here. Watson, help me get him to Baker Street." Watson nodded, though his mind was racing. "Holmes, if Haraway's a syndicate man, he could be feeding them our every move. Scotland Yard might be compromised." "Indeed," Holmes said, his voice grim, "which is why we trust no one until we know more. Mr. Crow, you will tell us everything, every detail, every contact, every delivery. Your sister's life may depend on it." Crow nodded, his face ashen. "I'll tell you what I know, but please find Clara. She's all I have." Holmes' expression softened, just for a moment. "We will, Mr. Crow. But first, we must survive the night." They moved quickly through the fog, sticking to the back alleys to avoid detection. Watson's mind churned with questions. How deep did the syndicate's reach go? Who was pulling the strings? And what was the significance of that strange symbol? He glanced at Holmes, whose face was set in that familiar mask of determination, and felt a surge of resolve. Whatever the syndicate was planning, they would face it together by the time they reached 221B Baker Street. The first light of dawn was beginning to pierce the fog. Mrs. Hudson, ever unflappable, greeted them with a tray of tea and a raised eyebrow at the sight of Crow, who looked like a man who'd seen his own grave. "Another stray, Mr. Holmes?" she asked, her tone dry. "A temporary guest," Holmes replied, ushering Crow inside. "Watson, see to our friend's comfort. I have work to do." As Watson settled Crow by the fire, Holmes retreated to his desk, pulling out the sketch of the symbol, and a stack of books on cryptography and alchemy. Watson knew that Holmes was diving into the puzzle, and nothing would deter him until he had answers. Over the next few hours, Holmes interrogated Crowe with relentless precision, extracting every detail of his work for the syndicate. Crowe described the forging process in meticulous detail, the special inks, the engraved plates, the careful aging of paper to mimic authentic bonds. He spoke of secret meetings in abandoned warehouses, cryptic messages delivered by masked couriers, and the ever-present threat of violence if he failed to deliver. But the identity of the syndicate's leader remained elusive, hidden behind layers of intermediaries like Haraway. Watson, meanwhile, kept watch at the window, half expecting syndicate enforcers to storm the street. The revelation of Haraway's betrayal gnawed at him how many others in Scotland Yard were compromised. The thought was chilling, but he trusted Holmes to navigate the web of deceit as evening fell. Holmes stood abruptly, his eyes alight with a sudden realization. "The symbol," he said, holding up Crowe's sketch, "it's not just alchemical, it's a cipher, a key to their communications. If I'm right, it points to a specific location, one they've been using all along." "Where?" Watson asked, leaning forward. Holmes traced the symbol's lines with his finger. "The warehouse by the docks, the one Crowe mentioned. It's not just a drop point, it's their hub. And tomorrow night's delivery is our chance to catch them in the act." "But Holmes," Watson said, "Crowe said it's a trap. If they know he's been talking, then we shall turn their trap against them," Holmes said, his voice cold and resolute. "Watson, prepare your revolver. Mr. Crowe, you will remain here under Mrs. Hudson's care. Tomorrow we go to war." Crowe looked as though he might protest, but the weight of his fear and his hope for Clara's safety silenced him. He nodded, slumping into the chair, while Holmes began pacing, his mind already mapping out the battle to come. Watson felt a familiar mix of dread and exhilaration. A chance. As the fire crackled and the fog thickened outside, Watson knew that the next 24 hours would test them like never before. The following day passed in a blur of preparation. Holmes spent hours poring over maps of the docks, cross-referencing Crowe's information with his own knowledge of London's underworld. Watson, meanwhile, checked and rechecked his revolver, ensuring it was in perfect working order. Mrs. Hudson, ever the unsung hero, kept a steady supply of tea and sandwiches coming, though she muttered about the state of her nerves with every knock at the door. Crowe remained in a state of nervous agitation, alternating between pacing the sitting room and staring blankly at the fire. Watson tried to reassure him, but the man's fear for his sister was palpable. "Do you think you can find her?" Crowe asked at one point, his voice barely above a whisper. "If anyone can, it's Holmes," Watson said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "He's never failed yet." As night fell, Holmes emerged from his study, his face set with purpose. "It's time," he said, donning a dark coat and scarf. The journey to the East End was tense, the fog thicker than the night before, reducing visibility to mere feet. Holmes led the way with unerring precision, navigating the labyrinthine streets as if they were a second home. Watson kept close, his senses alert for any sign of pursuit. The docks loomed ahead, a sprawling maze of warehouses, cranes, and moored ships, their silhouettes ghostly in the mist. The warehouse Crowe had described was a dilapidated structure. At the edge of the docks, its windows boarded up and its walls streaked with grime. Holmes paused at the entrance, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "No guards," he murmured. "Either they're overconfident, or we're walking into an ambush." Comforting thought. Watson said, gripping his revolver. Holmes pushed open the door, and they slipped inside. The interior was a cavernous space, lit only by a few flickering lanterns hanging from the rafters. Crates and barrels were stacked haphazardly, creating a maze of shadows. At the far end, off the warehouse, a single crate stood alone, marked with the same symbol Crow had drawn. Their Holmes whispered, pointing. The drop point. They crept forward, their footsteps silent on the damp floor. As they reached the crate, Holmes knelt to examine it, his fingers tracing the symbol. Freshly painted, he said. This was prepared recently, there, expecting a delivery tonight. Before Watson could respond, a low creak echoed through the warehouse, followed by the unmistakable sound of boots on wood. Holmes' hand shot up, signaling silence. They ducked behind a stack of crates, peering through the gaps as a group of men emerged from the shadows. There were 5 of them, all cloaked, their faces obscured by hoods. One carried a lantern, its light casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Crow's late," one of the men growled, his voice rough. "If he's double-crossed us, he won't," another said, his tone colder, more authoritative. "Haraway's got his sister. He knows what happens if he betrays us." Watson's blood ran cold at the mention of Haraway. He glanced at Holmes, who was listening intently, his eyes narrowed. The men approached the crate, and the one with the lantern set it down, revealing a bundle of papers forged bonds. Watson realized, their edges crisp and new. Holmes leaned close, his voice barely audible. "We need to get those bonds. They're evidence. But we must wait for the right moment." Watson nodded, his heart pounding. The men were spreading out now, checking the warehouse as if expecting trouble. One of them passed dangerously close to their hiding spot, his hand resting on a pistol at his belt. Watson held his breath, his finger on the trigger of his revolver. Suddenly, a new figure entered the warehouse, a tall, cloaked man with a commanding presence. His face was hidden, but his voice carried a chilling authority. "The bonds are here," he said. "But where is Crow?" "He's been compromised," the cold-voiced man said. "Haraway warned us. Someone's been asking questions, someone dangerous. The leaders who turn slightly, as if sensing something. Then we deal with it. Find Crow and eliminate anyone with him. The plan proceeds at midnight." Holmes' eyes gleamed with a fierce intensity. He leaned toward Watson, his voice a whisper. "Now, Watson, we take the bonds and run." Before Watson could protest, Holmes sprang from their hiding place, moving with the speed and precision of a panther. He snatched the bundle of bonds from the crate and bolted for a side door, Watson hot on his heels. The syndicate men shouted in alarm, drawing their weapons as they gave chase. The fog outside was a blessing and a curse, hiding them from view but making navigation treacherous. Holmes led the way, weaving through the maze of crates and barrels that littered the docks. Gunshots rang out behind them, the bullets whistling past as Watson ducked and ran. "Keep moving," Holmes shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. They reached a narrow alley and ducked inside, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter. Holmes clutched the bonds to his chest, his face alight with triumph. "We have them, Watson. The evidence we need to expose the syndicate." But their victory was short-lived. As they emerged from the alley, a figure stepped from the shadows, blocking their path. It was Constable Haraway, his face twisted with malice. A pistol aimed at Holmes' heart. "You should have stayed out of this, Holmes," Haraway said, his voice dripping with venom. "You and your meddling friend have caused enough trouble, Watson. raised his revolver, but Haraway's men appeared behind him, their weapons drawn. They were surrounded. Holmes, however, remained unfazed. "Constable Haraway," he said, his tone almost pleasant, "I wondered when you'd show your true colors. Tell me, how much did the syndicate pay you to betray your oath?" Haraway sneered. "More than you'll ever know. Drop the bonds, Holmes, or I'll put a bullet through your friend's skull." Watson tensed, his finger tightening on the trigger, but Holmes raised a hand, signaling calm. "Very well," Holmes said, slowly lowering the bonds to the ground. "But answer me this: who is your master? Who leads the Midnight Syndicate?" Haraway's smirk faltered, and for a moment Watson thought he might answer. But before he could speak, a sharp crack echoed through the alley, and Haraway staggered, blood blooming on his chest. He collapsed, dead, before he hit the ground. The syndicate men froze, their eyes darting to the shadows. A cloaked figure emerged, a smoking pistol in hand. "No loose ends," the figure said, its voice low and menacing. Before Watson could react, the figure fired again, and one of Haraway's men fell. Chaos erupted. Watson dove for cover, firing his revolver as the remaining syndicate men scattered. Holmes grabbed the bonds and pulled Watson into another alley, the sound of gunfire fading behind them. They ran until they reached a quiet street, their breaths ragged in the cold air. "Who was that?" Watson gasped, his heart still racing. Holmes' face was grim. "The syndicate's leader, or someone very close to them. They're tying up loose ends, Watson." Haraway was expendable, and so is Crow. "We have to get back to Baker Street," Watson said, his mind racing. "Crow's in danger." Holmes nodded, his eyes burning with determination. "And we must protect the bonds. They're the key to unraveling this conspiracy. Come, Watson, the game is afoot." As they hurried back to 2-1B, the fog seemed to close in around them, a silent reminder of the dangers that lurked in the shadows. Watson clutched his revolver, his resolve hardened. The Midnight Syndicate was a formidable foe, but with Holmes by his side, he knew they would not rest until the truth was brought to light. Back at Baker Street, they found Crow pacing the sitting room, his face pale with fear. Mrs. Hudson had locked the doors and drawn the curtains, her instincts as sharp as ever. "You're alive," Crow said, relief flooding his voice as they entered. "Did you get the bonds?" Holmes held up the bundle, his expression grim. "We did, but at a cost. Haraway is dead, killed by one of his own. The syndicate is cleaning house." Crow's knees buckled, and he sank into a chair. "Clara," he whispered, "if they're killing their own, what chance does she have?" Holmes placed a hand on his shoulder, a rare gesture of comfort. "We will find her, Mr. Crow, but we must act quickly. The syndicate knows we're onto them, and they'll move to protect their leader. Watson, we need to analyze these bonds. They may hold clues to the syndicate's next move." As Watson set about examining the bonds, Holmes returned to his books, cross-referencing the symbol with every text he could find. The night stretched on, the air thick with tension, as they pieced together the fragments of the syndicate's plan. The bonds were flawless, their craftsmanship a testament to Crow's skill. But hidden within the intricate designs was a patina, subtle variation in the ink that Holmes recognized as a code. "It's a message," Holmes said, his voice tinged with excitement. "A set of coordinates, embedded in the bonds themselves. They point to a location in London, a place where the syndicate plans to strike next." "Where?" Watson asked, looking up from the bonds. Holmes' eyes gleamed. The Bank of England. The syndicate isn't just planning to flood the market, they're planning to strike at the heart of the nation's economy, and they're doing it soon. Watson felt a surge of determination. The stakes were higher than ever, but with Holmes leading the way, they had a chance to stop the syndicate before it was too late. As the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, Watson knew that the battle was far from over, but they were ready to face it together. Chapter 6. The enigmatic symbol. The gaslit streets of London were cloaked in a restless quiet as Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson made their way back to 2-1B Baker Street. The cryptic note from Mr. Harrow's belongings clutched tightly in Holmes' gloved hand. The night air was heavy with the scent of coal smoke and damp cobblestones, and the faint echo of a distant hansom cab clattered through the fog. Watson, ever the steadfast companion, glanced at Holmes, whose sharp features were illuminated intermittently by the flickering The detective's brow was furrowed, his eyes narrowed in deep contemplation. As though the note in his hand were a puzzle box he was determined to unlock. "Holmes," Watson ventured, breaking the silence, "you've been staring at that scrap of paper for the better part of an hour. Have you made any sense of it?" Holmes did not immediately reply. His fingers traced the edges of the note, where a peculiar symbol circled bisected by a diagonal line, with a smaller triangle inscribed within. It stood out among the jumble of coded letters and numbers. The symbol had appeared not only on the note but also in the torn ledger they had recovered from the warehouse in the East End. It was a recurring motif, a thread that seemed to tie the Midnight Syndicate's machinations together. Yet its meaning remained frustratingly elusive. "Patience," Watson Holmes said at last, his voice low and measured. "This symbol is no mere doodle. It is the key to understanding the syndicate's true purpose. Its design is deliberate, ancient even, and I suspect it holds secrets far beyond the financial scheme we uncovered at the docks." Watson frowned, adjusting his coat against the chill. "Ancient? You mean to say this conspiracy has roots in some forgotten history?" "Precisely," Holmes replied, his eyes glinting with a spark of excitement. "The Midnight Syndicate may cloak itself in the guise of a modern criminal enterprise, but this symbol suggests a deeper, more esoteric foundation. We must uncover its origins, for it may reveal the syndicate's ultimate aim." Back at Baker Street, the familiar warmth of their lodgings offered a brief respite from the night's intrigues. Mrs. Hudson, ever attentive, had left a tray of tea and biscuits on the table, though Holmes ignored it, his attention fixed solely on the note. He spread it out on his clotted desk, alongside the torn ledger, and began to compare the two. The ledger, with its list of prominent names, had already yielded the troubling clue of Sir Reginald Baxter's involvement, but it was the symbol that now consumed Holmes' focus. Watson settled into his armchair, watching as Holmes retrieved a magnifying glass and leaned over the document. The detective's movements were precise, almost mechanical, as he examined the ink, the paper's texture, and the faint impressions left by the writer's hand. After a long silence, Holmes straightened, his expression one of guarded triumph. "The symbol," he said, "is not a creation of the syndicate. It is far older, borrowed from a source they likely do not fully understand themselves. Notice the precision of its lines. Watson, the circle is perfect, the triangle equilateral. This is no hasty sketch, but a mark steeped in tradition." Watson leaned forward, peering at the symbol. To his untrained eye, it looked like little more than an abstract design, but he trusted Holmes' instincts implicitly. "And what tradition might that be?" he asked. Holmes paced the room, his hands clasped behind his back. I have seen this symbol, or variations of it, in my studies of esoteric societies. It resembles the sigils used by alchemical orders of the Renaissance, groups that cloaked their scientific pursuits in mysticism. The circle often represents unity or perfection, the triangle a trinity, perhaps of elements or of power. The diagonal line is less common, but it may signify division or transformation. Alchemy, Watson said, his tone skeptical. Surely you don't believe the Midnight Syndicate is dabbling in turning lead into gold? Holmes gave a faint smile. Not in the literal sense, Watson, but alchemical societies were often less concerned with metallurgy than with power, social, political, or even spiritual. They used their symbols to communicate in secret, to bind their members to a shared purpose. If the syndicate has adopted this mark, it suggests they are not merely criminals, but ideologues, driven by a vision that transcends profit. The weight of Holmes' words settled over the room. Watson felt a chill, not from the drafty windows, but from the realization that the conspiracy they faced might be far more complex than a scheme to destabilize London's banks. He glanced at the clock, which showed the hour approaching 11. The night was still young, and Holmes was already reaching for his coat. "Come, Watson," he said, his voice brisk. "We must consult an expert on such matters. There is no time to lose." "Who might that be?" Watson asked, rising to follow. "Professor Cornelius Langley," Holmes replied, "a scholar of antiquities and esoteric law, retired from Oxford, but still residing in London. If anyone can shed light on this symbol, it is he." The journey to Professor Langley's residence took them through the winding streets of Bloomsbury, where the fog seemed to thicken with every step. Langley lived in a modest townhouse, its facade unremarkable save for the faint glow of candlelight in the upper windows. Holmes knocked sharply, and after a brief wait, the door was opened by an elderly housekeeper, her expression wary. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Holmes announced. "We must speak with Professor Langley on a matter of utmost urgency." The housekeeper hesitated, then ushered them inside. The interior of the house was a labyrinth of books and artifacts, shelves groaning under the weight of leather-bound tomes and curious relics. The air smelled of old paper and wax, and the dim light cast long shadows across the cluttered rooms. They were led to a study where Professor Langley sat at a desk, surrounded by manuscripts and a clutter of alchemical instruments, alembics, and a small brass astrolabe. Langley was a frail man, his white hair thinning and his eyes magnified by thick spectacles. He looked up as they entered, his expression a mix of surprise and curiosity. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice reedy but sharp, "to what do I owe this late visit?" Holmes wasted no time. He placed the note and a sketch of the ledger's symbol on the desk. "Professor, we need your expertise. This symbol, have you seen it before?" Langley adjusted his spectacles and leaned over the papers. His fingers trembled slightly as he traced the symbol's lines, and his face grew pale. "Good heavens," he murmured, "where did you find this?" "It is connected to a case," Holmes said, his tone neutral but probing. "A group calling themselves the Midnight Syndicate. What can you tell us about it?" Langley's eyes darted to the door, as though ensuring they were alone. He lowered his voice. "This symbol is ancient, Mr. Holmes. It belongs to the Order of the Saffron Veil, an alchemical society from the 16th century. They were a secretive group, believed to pursue not only scientific knowledge, but also influence over the courts of Europe. Their sigil, a circle, triangle, and diagonal was said to represent the transformation of society through hidden means. Watson exchanged a glance with Holmes. "And this order," Watson said, "does it still exist?" Langley shook his head, but his expression was troubled. "Not in its original form. The order was disbanded centuries ago, its members scattered or executed for their radical ideas. But there have been whispers, rumors of modern revivals, groups adopting their symbols and ideals. If this Midnight Syndicate uses their mark, they may see themselves as heirs to the Order's legacy." Holmes leaned forward, his gaze intense. "What was the Order's ultimate goal, Professor?" Langley hesitated, his fingers tightening round the edge of his desk. "Power, Mr. Holmes. Not merely wealth or political influence, but a reshaping of the world according to their vision. They believed in a great work, a new order where the enlightened would rule. Some accounts suggest they dabbled in the occult, using rituals to bind their members and instill fear in their enemies." The word occult hung in the air, and Watson felt another pang of unease. He had seen Holmes unravel many a mystery, but this talk of secret societies and ancient rituals was uncharted territory. Holmes, however, seemed undeterred, his mind already racing ahead. "Is there anything else you can tell us?" Holmes pressed. "Any texts, any names associated with the Order that might help us identify the Syndicate's leaders?" Langley rose unsteadily and crossed to a bookshelf, pulling down a heavy volume bound in cracked leather. "This is a rare copy of De Occulta Philosophia, a text the Order revered. It contains references to their rituals and symbols, though much of it is written in cipher. I can lend it to you, but I warn you, Mr. Holmes, these are dangerous waters. The Order's successors, if they exist, will not take kindly to interference." Holmes took the book, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Professor. Your assistance is invaluable. We shall take every precaution." As they left Langley's house, the fog had thickened, swallowing the street in a grey haze. Watson clutched his revolver, a habit born of their many perilous adventures, while Holmes seemed lost in thought, the book tucked under his arm. They hailed a cab, and as the horses' hooves clattered against the cobblestones, Holmes spoke. "The Midnight Syndicate is not merely a criminal organization, Watson. They are driven by a philosophy, a belief in their own superiority. This symbol is their creed, their rallying cry. We must decode its full meaning if we are to anticipate their next move." The cab ride back to Baker Street was silent, save for the creak of the wheels and the occasional shout of a street vendor. Watson's mind churned with questions, but he knew better than to interrupt Holmes in such a mood. The detective's focus was absolute, his thoughts a labyrinth as complex as the conspiracy they sought to unravel. Back in their lodgings, Holmes set to work immediately. He spread out De Occulta Philosophia on the table, alongside the note and ledger, and began cross-referencing the symbol with the book's cryptic passages. Watson, though exhausted, remained by his side, fetching tea and offering occasional observations. Hours passed, the clock ticking toward dawn. As Holmes pieced together fragments of meaning, "The diagonal line," Holmes said suddenly, breaking the silence. "In the Order's texts, it represents a fracture, a breaking of the old to usher in the new. The Syndicate's plan to destabilize London's economy is not an end in itself, but a means to fracture the current order. They seek chaos, Watson, to pave the way for their own rule." Watson rubbed his eyes, struggling to keep up. "But who are they, Holmes? Who could orchestrate such a scheme?" "That," Holmes said, his voice grim, "is what we must discover. The symbol is a clue, but it is also a warning. The syndicate is watching, and they know we are on their trail. We must be vigilant. The next day brought a fresh lead. Holmes, after a brief consultation with his network of informants, irregulars, as he called them, learned of a clandestine meeting rumoured to take place in a foggy cemetery on the outskirts of London. The location was unusual, even for the syndicate, and Holmes suspected it held significance tied to the Order's rituals. Armed with this knowledge, he and Watson prepared for a dangerous excursion. The cemetery was a desolate place, its gravestones weathered and half hidden by mist. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and the silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Holmes moved with the precision of a hunter, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Watson, revolver at the ready, followed close behind, his nerves taut. They had not gone far when Holmes raised a hand, signalling for silence. Ahead, through the fog, they saw a faint flicker of lighter lantern, perhaps, or a candle. Creeping closer, they discerned the outlines of several figures, cloaked and hooded, gathered around a weathered mausoleum. The symbol from the note was carved into the stone, its lines stark against the moss-covered surface. Holmes motioned for Watson to stay low, and they crouched behind a crumbling headstone, listening intently. The figures spoke in low, urgent tones, their words too muffled to discern. But one phrase stood out, repeated like a mantra: "The great work begins at midnight." Watson's heart pounded. The phrase echoed Langley's words, a chilling confirmation of the syndicate's connection to the Order of the Saffron Veil. Before they could glean more, a twig snapped under Watson's foot, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. The figures froze, their heads turning toward the noise. Holmes acted swiftly, pulling Watson behind a larger monument as the figures drew weapons, knives, and pistols glinting in the lantern light. "Stay calm," Holmes whispered, his voice steady. "We are outnumbered, but they are not expecting us to fight back." What followed was a blur of action. The syndicate enforcers fanned out, searching the cemetery, their footsteps crunching on the gravel paths. Holmes, with his uncanny knack for improvisation, used the fog to their advantage, leading Watson through a maze of gravestones to avoid detection, but the enforcers were relentless, and soon they were closing in. "Holmes," Watson hissed, "we can't outrun them forever." "Then we fight," Holmes replied, his eyes gleaming with determination. He drew a small derringer from his coat pocket, a weapon Watson had rarely seen him using, handed Watson a second revolver. "Aim for their legs, Watson. We need them alive for questioning." The ambush came swiftly. Two enforcers lunged from the fog, their knives flashing. Watson fired, his shot grazing one man's thigh, sending him sprawling. Holmes disarmed the second with a precise strike to the wrist, his movements a blend of grace and ferocity. But more figures emerged, and the situation grew dire. Holmes, ever resourceful, spotted a rusted iron gate leading to an underground crypt. He dragged Watson toward it, kicking the gate open and pulling them inside just as a bullet grazed the stone above their heads. The crypt was dark and damp, its walls adorned with the same alchemical symbol they had seen before. In the faint light of Holmes' pocket lantern, they saw ritualistic markings, triangles, and cryptic runes shed into the stone. "This is no mere meeting place," Holmes said, his voice low. "This is a sanctum, a place of ritual. The syndicate's motives are indeed tied to the occult, as Langley suggested." Watson, catching his breath, examined the markings. "What do they mean, Holmes? Are they truly performing rituals, or is this all a ruse?" Holmes traced a rune with his finger. The truth lies somewhere in between. The occult trappings may be a tool to inspire loyalty, to bind the syndicate's members through fear and awe. But the symbol's presence here, in a place so carefully chosen, suggests a deeper belief, at least among the leaders. Their exploration was cut short by the sound of footsteps above. The enforcers had found the crypt's entrance. Holmes extinguished the lantern, plunging them into darkness. "We must move," he whispered. "There will be another exit. Such places always have one." Guided by Holmes' keen sense of direction, they navigated the crypt's narrow passages, emerging through a hidden door into a wooded area beyond the cemetery. The fog had begun to lift, and the first light of dawn painted the sky in hues of grey and gold. They had escaped, but the encounter left them with more questions than answers. Back at Baker Street, Holmes pored over De Occulta Philosophia with renewed urgency, cross-referencing the crypt's runes with the book's ciphers. Watson, nursing a minor bruise from their escape, watched in awe as Holmes' mind worked at a feverish pace. By midday, he had made a breakthrough. "The runes in the crypt," Holmes said, "are a variation of the Order's cipher, used to mark their inner sanctum. They speak of a midnight reckoning, a final act to usher in their new order. The Syndicate's plan, Watson, is not merely to destabilize the economy, but to seize control in the chaos that follows. The forged bonds, the banker's disappearance, the occult trappings, all are steps toward this reckoning." Watson felt a chill run down his spine. "And what is this reckoning?" Holmes' eyes darkened. "I suspect it involves a single, catastrophic act, something that will shake London to its core. We must find their next target before it is too late." The day passed in a flurry of activity. Holmes dispatched the irregulars to scour the city for any sign of syndicate activity, while he and Watson prepared for their next move. The trail was growing hotter, but so too was the danger. The syndicate was aware of their pursuit, and the ambush in the cemetery proved they were willing to kill to protect their secrets. As night fell, Holmes received a message from one of his informants, street urchin named Wiggins, who reported a sighting of cloaked figures near a derelict theatre in Whitechapel. The theatre, long abandoned, was rumoured to be a meeting place for the city's underbelly. Holmes saw it as their next opportunity to infiltrate the syndicate. "We shall attend this meeting." "Watson," Holmes said, his voice resolute, "but we must be prepared for treachery. The syndicate is cunning, and we are treading on their sacred ground." Watson nodded, checking his revolver. "I'm with you, Holmes. Whatever this Midnight Syndicate is planning, we'll stop them." Holmes gave a rare, fleeting smile. "I have no doubt of that, my dear Watson. Now, let us don our disguises and venture into the lion's den." As they prepared to leave, Holmes tucked the cryptic note and De Occulta Philosophia into his coat, the symbol of the Midnight Syndicate burning in his mind. The game was afoot, and the stakes had never been higher. The enigmatic symbol had opened a door to a conspiracy that threatened not only London, but the very fabric of society. And Sherlock Holmes, with Watson at his side, was determined to bring it to light. Chapter 7. N. The fog lay thick over London, a suffocating blanket that clung to the cobblestones and shrouded the city in an eerie, spectral haze. It was the kind of night where shadows seemed to move of their own accord, and every sound, be it the creak of a cartwheel or the distant bark of a dog, carried an ominous weight. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson moved cautiously through the mist, their footsteps muffled by the damp streets as they approached Highgate Cemetery, a sprawling necropolis in the northern reaches of the city. The lead they followed was tenuous. A scrap of information gleaned from the torn ledger found in the warehouser, cryptic reference to a place of eternal rest, where the Midnight Syndicate would convene under the cover of darkness. Holmes, clad in a dark overcoat that blended seamlessly with the fog, paused at the cemetery's iron gates. His sharp eyes scanned the surroundings, noting the rusted hinges and the faint glow of a lantern flickering in the distance, barely piercing the mist. Watson, ever the steadfast companion, stood close, his hand resting lightly on the revolver, concealed beneath his coat. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and a chill ran through Watson, though he could not tell if it was from the cold or the foreboding atmosphere. "Stay alert, Watson," Holmes murmured, his voice low and steady. "The Syndicate is cunning, and this fog is their ally. We are walking into their domain now." Watson nodded, his jaw set. "Do you think this is another of their meetings, or something else entirely?" Holmes' lips twitched into a faint, mirthless smile. "Something else, I wager. The ledger mentioned a consecration at this location. The Syndicate's plans are layered, Watson crime cloaked in ritual, ambition disguised as mysticism. We must tread carefully." With a gentle push, Holmes eased the gate open, its groan swallowed by the fog. The two men slipped inside, moving like spectres among the tombstones. The cemetery was a labyrinth of weathered stone and ivy-covered mausoleums, its paths winding through rows of silent graves. The fog distorted distances, making every monument loom like a phantom before receding into obscurity. Holmes led the way, his keen senses attuned to the slightest disturbance, a snapped twig, a misplaced pebble. Watson followed, his heart pounding, though years of accompanying Holmes on such perilous ventures had taught him to trust his friends' instincts implicitly. They had been tracking the Midnight Syndicate for days, piecing together fragments of their elaborate scheme. The ledger, with its list of prominent names and cryptic symbols, had confirmed Holmes' suspicion that the Syndicate was no mere criminal gang but a sophisticated network with ambitions far beyond petty theft. The disappearance of Sir Reginald Baxter, the banker whose name appeared in the ledger, had only deepened the mystery, and the revelation from Elias Crowe, the forger, about forged bonds intended to destabilize London's economy had set Holmes' mind ablaze with possibilities. Yet the recurring alchemical symbol, a circle bisected by a cross, with a crescent moon at its center, hinted at something more arcane. A motive that Professor Langley had suggested might tie to an ancient esoteric society. Tonight, in this fog-choked cemetery, Holmes hoped to uncover the next piece of the puzzle. They moved deeper into the cemetery, the fog growing denser with each step. The lantern light they had spotted earlier had vanished, leaving only the faint outlines of gravestones to guide them. Holmes paused beside a towering obelisk, its surface etched with faded inscriptions. He crouched, examining the ground, his fingers brushing over the damp earth. "Footprints," he said, Lilliputian, barely audible. "Recent, several pairs, heading that way." He pointed into the fog, toward a cluster of mausoleums, barely visible in the distance. Watson squinted, trying to make out the shapes in the mist. A meeting, then, or a trap? Holmes stood, his expression unreadable. Possibly both. "Come, Watson. We must be swift, but silent." They crept forward, their movements masked by the fog. The air grew colder, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of moisture from the branches overhead. As they approached the mausoleums, Holmes raised a hand, signaling Watson to stop. He tilted his head, listening intently. A faint murmur reached their ears, voices, low and indistinct, emanating from a large, ivy-clad tomb just ahead. The structure was ancient, its stone walls crumbling, with a heavy iron door slightly ajar. Holmes motioned for Watson to follow, and they edged closer, pressing themselves against the side of the mausoleum. The voices grew clearer, though the words were still unintelligible. Holmes peered through the crack in the door, his eyes narrowing. Inside, a faint glow illuminated a small group of figures, their faces obscured by hoods. They stood in a circle around a stone altar, upon which lay a collection of objects: candles, a chalice, and what appeared to be a leather-bound book. The scene was strange, almost theatrical, yet there was an air of menace that set Watson's nerves on edge. Before Watson could respond, a twig snapped behind them. They whirled around, but the fog was too thick to see more than a few feet. Holmes' hand shot out, gripping Watson's arm, and he pulled him down behind a nearby gravestone. A moment later, the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel approached. Two figures emerged from the fog, their silhouettes tall and imposing. They wore long cloaks, and their faces were hidden by scarves, but the glint of steel in their hands was unmistakable: knives, long and wickedly sharp. Holmes pressed a finger to his lips, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The figures paused, their heads turning as if searching for something or someone. Watson's grip tightened on his revolver, but Holmes shook his head slightly, indicating restraint. The figures moved on, disappearing into the fog. But their presence confirmed Holmes' suspicions. This was no ordinary meeting. We were expected. Holmes whispered, his voice barely audible. The syndicate knows someone is onto them. This ritual may be a lure. Watson frowned. Then why are we here? If it's a trap, because traps reveal as much as they conceal, Holmes interrupted. The bait is designed to draw us out, but in doing so, they expose their methods, their numbers, perhaps even their purpose. We must observe, not engage, not yet. They crept closer to the mausoleum, careful to avoid the loose stones that littered the path. The voices inside grew louder, and now Holmes could make out fragments of conversation. The words were laced with references to the offering and the new dawn, terms that echoed the occult undertones Professor Langley had warned of. Yet Holmes' expression remained skeptical, as if he saw through the theatricality to the practical motive beneath. Suddenly, a loud crack split the air, a gunshot, echoing through the fog. The voices inside the mausoleum fell silent, and the sound of running footsteps followed. Holmes and Watson pressed themselves flat against the wall, their hearts racing. The iron door burst open, and three cloaked figures sprinted out, vanishing into the mist. Holmes waited a beat, then darted inside, Watson close behind. The interior of the mausoleum was dimly lit by a single candle on the altar. The objects they had seen, a chalice, a book, and several small vials, were scattered across the stone surface, as if abandoned in haste. Holmes approached the altar, his eyes scanning every detail. The book was old, its leather cover worn and cracked, but the symbol etched into it was unmistakable: the alchemical circle with the crescent moon. Watson glanced around, his revolver drawn. What was that shot? Did they fire at us? No, Holmes said, his voice calm but intense. The shot was not aimed at us. It was a signal or a distraction. He lifted the book, flipping through its pages with gloved hands. This is a ledger of sorts, but not financial. It records names, dates, and what appear to be ritualistic acts. The syndicate is meticulous in its deception. Before Watson could ask more, a low groan came from the shadows. Holmes spun around, his cane raised like a weapon, but the sound came from a figure slumped against the wall, a man, bleeding heavily from a wound in his side. Watson rushed to him, his medical instincts taking over. The man was young, no older than 30, with a pale face and wide, terrified eyes. His cloak bore the same symbol as the book, marking him as a member of the syndicate. "Help me," the man gasped, clutching Watson's arm. Watson tore open the man's shirt, examining the wound. Bullet wound, clean through. "He's losing blood fast. We need to get him to a hospital." Holmes knelt beside them, his expression unreadable. "Who shot you?" he asked, his tone sharp but controlled. The man coughed, blood flecking his lips. They knew. Traitor. His eyes darted to the book in Holmes' hand. "You can't stop the syndicate. Too powerful." Holmes leaned closer, his voice low and commanding. "Who is the leader? Give me a name." The man's breath hitched and his eyes fluttered. "Crane, Lord." His voice trailed off and his head slumped forward. Watson checked his pulse, his face. "Grim, he's gone." Holmes stood, his jaw tight. "Lord Crane, a name at last." He turned to the altar, his mind already racing ahead. "This was no random act, Watson. The syndicate is purging its own ranks either to silence a traitor or to send a message to us." Watson stood, wiping his hands on his coat. "A message. They're taunting us." "Precisely," Holmes replied, slipping the book into his coat. "They want us to know they are watching. B." "The book is a plant," Holmes said, patting his coat where the ledger was hidden. "It contains just enough truth to lure us deeper, but not enough to expose their full plan. As for the man, his death was a warning year, demonstration of their ruthlessness." They moved swiftly through the cemetery, weaving between tombstones and avoiding the open paths where the fog offered little cover. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, faint but persistent, confirming that the syndicate's enforcers were still searching. Holmes led them toward the cemetery's edge, where a low stone wall separated the grounds from the street beyond. As they reached the wall, a sudden shout broke the silence. "There," a voice called, followed by the sound of running feet. A figure loomed out of the fog, brandishing a knife that gleamed in the dim light. Watson fired a single shot, the sound muffled by the fog, and the figure dropped with a cry. Holmes grabbed Watson's arm, pulling him over the wall. "No time, Watson. We must lose them in the streets." They landed on the other side, the cobblestones slick with moisture. The fog was thicker here, swallowing the street in a grey haze. Holmes led the way, his knowledge of London's labyrinthine alleys guiding them through a maze of narrow streets and shadowed courtyards. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter, but Holmes did not slow his pace until they reached a quiet side street near a small tavern, its windows glowing faintly through the fog. They slipped inside, the warmth of the tavern a stark contrast to the chill outside. The room was sparsely populated, a few weary patrons nursing their drinks in the dim light. Holmes and Watson took a table in the corner, their backs to the wall, and ordered a pair of ales to blend in. The barmaid, a tired-looking woman with a sharp eye, gave them a cursory glance before returning to her duties. Watson took a sip of his ale, his hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline. "That was too close, Holmes. If they had caught us in that tunnel." "They did not," Holmes said, his tone matter-of-fact, "but we must assume they are tracking us. The syndicate's reach is extensive, and their resources are considerable. Lord Crane, if he is indeed the leader, has both motive and means to orchestrate such a scheme. Watson leaned forward, his voice low. What do we do now? The book, the symbol, the dead man, it's all connected, but we're still in the dark about their true plan. Holmes pulled the book from his coat, placing it on the table between them. This ledger is a key, Watson, but a locked one. The names and dates suggest a network of operatives. But the rituals are a facade, a means of control, perhaps, or a way to inspire loyalty through fear. The real plan, as Crow revealed, is economic sabotage through forged bonds. But there is more to it. Crane's involvement suggests a personal vendetta, possibly against the government or the financial elite. He opened the book, revealing pages filled with neat, precise handwriting. The entries listed names, some familiar, others obscure, alongside dates and cryptic descriptions of offerings and initiations. The alchemical symbol appeared frequently, drawn with meticulous care. Holmes traced his finger over one such symbol, his eyes narrowing. Professor Langley was correct, he said. This symbol is tied to an ancient alchemical society, one that believed in transformation, not just of metals, but of society itself. The Syndicate may be using this mythology to cloak their true intentions, but the occult element cannot be entirely dismissed. It holds power over their followers. Watson frowned, glancing at the book. You think they're using this mysticism to manipulate people? To what end? Power, Holmes said simply. Control. The promise of a new dawn is a potent lure, especially for those disillusioned with the current order. Crane, disgraced and humiliated, may see himself as the architect of a new world, built on the ruins of the old. The tavern door creaked open, and both men tensed, their hands moving instinctively to their weapons. But it was only a drunken labourer stumbling in from the fog. Holmes relaxed slightly, though his eyes remained sharp. We must proceed with utmost caution, he said. The Syndicate's mole within Scotland Yard, likely Constable Harraway, if my suspicions are correct, means our movements are compromised. We cannot trust Lestrade's men, not yet. Watson nodded, his face grim. What's our next move, then? Holmes closed the book, slipping it back into his coat. We return to Baker Street and analyze this ledger in detail. There are patterns here, connections that will lead us to the Syndicate's next step. The mention of a consecration suggests a major event, a public act, perhaps to cement their power. We must also investigate Lord Crane's history, his allies, his weaknesses. They finished their drinks and stepped back into the fog, the city a maze of shadows and secrets. The encounter in the cemetery had been a close call, but it had also brought them closer to the heart of the Midnight Syndicate. As they made their way through the silent streets, Holmes' mind was already at work, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle, the ledger, the symbol, the name of Lord Crane. The fog might obscure the path, but Sherlock Holmes was undeterred, his resolve as unyielding as the stones of London itself. The night was far from over, and the game was afoot. Chapter 9. The Midnight Meeting. The fog hung low over London, a dense, choking shroud that seemed to swallow the city whole. The gaslights flickered like weary sentinels, their dim glow barely piercing the miasma that clung to the cobblestones. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson moved silently through the narrow alleys of Whitechapel, their footsteps muffled by the damp air. Disguised as members of the Midnight Syndicate, they wore heavy cloaks, their faces partially obscured by wide-brimmed hats pulled low. Holmes had meticulously crafted their disguises. ensuring every detail from the worn boots to the subtle stains on their cuffs, slined with the syndicate's secretive operatives. Watson, though accustomed to Holmes' penchant for theatrics, felt the weight of the moment pressing against his chest. The air was thick with anticipation, and the revolver in his coat pocket offered only a fleeting sense of security. Holmes had deciphered the cryptic note found among Mr. Harrow's belongings, its symbols pointing to a derelict theatre in the heart of Whitechapel. The note had been a puzzle of alchemical sigils and coded phrases, but Holmes' keen mind had unraveled it, revealing the time and place of the syndicate's next clandestine meeting. Midnight, the old vicarage theatre, he had murmured, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the chase. Now, as they approached the crumbling facade of the theatre, its once grand marquee sagging under years of neglect, Watson couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into the lion's den. "Keep your wits about you, Watson," Holmes whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant clatter of a passing hansom cab. "The syndicate is no amateur cabal. They'll be watching for interlopers." Watson nodded, adjusting the brim of his hat. "And if they spot us?" Holmes' lips curled into a faint, mirthless smile. "Then we shall have to rely on our ingenuity and your marksmanship." The theatre loomed ahead, its windows borders, his eyes scanning every shadow. Watson followed, his hand resting lightly on the revolver. They descended a narrow staircase to the basement, where the syndicate's meeting was to take place. The faint murmur of voices grew louder as they approached, and Holmes raised a hand to signal caution. They reached a heavy wooden door, its surface scarred and splintered. Through a crack, they could see a dimly lit chamber, illuminated by flickering oil lamps. Cloaked figures stood in a loose circle, their faces hidden beneath hoods. At the center of the room stood a tall, imposing figure, their voice low and commanding. Holmes pressed his ear to the door, his expression intense as he listened. "The gala is our moment," the figure was saying. "The forged bonds must be delivered to the foreign investors without fail. Once they flood the market, the Bank of England will falter, and our influence will grow." Watson's heart sank. The plan to destabilize London's financial system was no mere rumor, it was unfolding before their eyes. He glanced at Holmes, whose eyes were narrowed, his mind clearly racing to catalogue every word. The speaker continued, their voice sharp with authority. "Lady Vaughan will oversee the exchange. Her presence at the gala ensures our legitimacy. The investors will suspect nothing until it's too late." Watson's breath caught. Lady Eleanor Vonther, socialite whose name had appeared in the torn ledger. Holmes had suspected her involvement, but this confirmed her as a key player in the syndicate's machinations. He leaned closer to Watson, his voice a mere breath. "We must observe her closely. She's the linchpin." The meeting continued, with the cloaked figures discussing logistics, safe houses, coded signals, and contingencies. Holmes memorized every detail, his mind a steel trap. Watson, meanwhile, struggled to keep his nerves steady. The syndicate's reach was vast, their plan meticulous. The thought of forged bonds flooding London's economy was chilling, and the stakes felt higher than ever. As the meeting drew to a close, the leader raised a hand, and the room fell silent. "The hour approaches," they intoned. "The Midnight Syndicate will usher in a new order for the glory of the ancient ones." The phrase sent a shiver down Watson's spine. The occult undertones, first hinted at by Professor Langley, were no mere affectation. The syndicate's motives seemed to blend cold pragmatism with something far darker. Holmes' expression remained unreadable, But Watson knew his friend was piecing together the puzzle, connecting the alchemical symbols to this cryptic invocation. The figures began to disperse, filing out through a hidden passage at the far end of the chamber. Holmes and Watson retreated silently, slipping back into the shadows of the theatre. They moved quickly, their disguises holding as they navigated the labyrinthine corridors. Outside, the fog had thickened, cloaking them as they emerged into the night. "We've learnt much, but we're not out of danger yet," Holmes said, his voice low. "Lady Vaughan is the key. Her role at the gala will be our chance to strike." Watson nodded, his mind racing. "But how do we get close to her? She'll be surrounded by her allies." Holmes' eyes gleamed with determination. "We attend the gala, Watson, as guests, not infiltrators. I have a plan." The days leading to the gala were a blur of preparation. Holmes, with his usual meticulousness, crafted new identities for himself and Watson. They would pose as wealthy investors from the continent, invited to the exclusive event at the Grand Royal Hall, where Lady Vaughan was to orchestrate the syndicate's scheme. Holmes procured forged invitations through his network of contacts, each detail flawless. Watson marveled at his friend's ability to navigate the underworld as easily as he did. London's high society, Holmes also spent hours studying Lady Vaughan's habits. Using his connections, he gathered intelligence on her movements, her associates, and her public persona. She was a widow of considerable wealth, known for her charm and philanthropy, but Holmes suspected her benevolence was a mask. "She's cunning," he told Watson. "Her influence stems not from wealth alone, but from her ability to manipulate those around her. We must be cautious." Watson, meanwhile, prepared for the physical demands of the mission. He cleaned and loaded his revolver, practiced his cover story, and studied the layout of the Grand Royal Hall. The gala would be a glittering affair, attended by London's elite, but beneath the chandeliers and champagne, a deadly game would unfold on the night of the gala. Holmes and Watson stood before a mirror in their Baker Street lodgings, adjusting their attire. Holmes wore a tailored suit, his hair slicked back, his demeanor that of a confident financier. Watson, though less comfortable in his role, looked the part of a prosperous merchant. "You look positively respectable, Watson," Holmes said, with a rare grin. "I feel like a fraud," Watson muttered, tugging at his collar. "Good," Holmes replied. "That's precisely the point." They arrived at the Grand Royal Hall in a hired carriage, their invitations granting them seamless entry. The hall was a vision of opulence, its marble floors gleaming, its walls adorned with gilt-framed portraits. The air was filled with the hum of conversation, the clink of glasses, and the strains of a string quartet. Watson scanned the crowd, noting the presence of several figures from the syndicate's ledger. The web of conspiracy was vast, and they were at its heart. Holmes' eyes locked onto Lady Eleanor Vaughan almost immediately. She stood at the center of the room, radiant in a gown of deep emerald, her auburn hair swept into an elegant chignon. She moved with effortless grace, her smile disarming as she greeted guests. But Holmes saw what others missed: the subtle glances she exchanged with certain individuals, the way her fingers lingered on a guest's arm, conveying a silent message. "She's signaling," Holmes whispered to Watson. "Watch her hands. The syndicate members are here, and she's directing them." Watson followed Holmes' gaze, noting the pattern. Lady Vaughan's gestures were subtle: a touch to her earring, a tilt of her fan, but they carried meaning. Holmes began to decipher the code, his mind racing as he catalogued each movement. "She's coordinating the delivery of the forged bonds," he murmured. "The investors are her targets." As the night progressed, Holmes and Watson mingled, their false identities holding under scrutiny. Watson played his role well, engaging in small talk with bankers and diplomats, while Holmes kept Lady Vaughan in his peripheral vision. The tension was palpable, each moment bringing them closer to the syndicate's endgame. At one point, Lady Vaughan excused herself from the crowd, slipping through a side door into a private parlour. Holmes signalled to Watson, and they followed, at a discreet distance. The parlour was dimly lit, its walls lined with bookshelves. Lady Vaughan stood before a group of 3 men, their faces unfamiliar but their postures tense. Holmes and Watson crouched behind a heavy curtain, listening. "The bonds are in place," Lady Vaughan said, her voice low. "The investors will take them tonight, and by dawn the market will be ours." One of the men, a wiry figure with a scar across his cheek, Hayes. Chapter 8. The double agent. The fog hung heavy over London, a thick, choking shroud that seemed to swallow sound and light alike. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson moved through the narrow streets of Whitechapel, their footsteps muffled by the damp cobblestones. The events of the past days weighed heavily on them. Harrow's poisoning, the cryptic note, the shadowy figures in the warehouse, and the chilling discovery in the foggy cemetery. The Midnight Syndicate was proving to be a formidable adversary, always one step ahead, as if they had eyes and ears in every corner of the city. Holmes' sharp mind churned with possibilities, but one suspicion had taken root. The syndicate's uncanny ability to evade capture suggested a betrayal from within. Watson, his face set in a grim line, adjusted his coat against the chill. "Holmes," he said, his voice low, "how can we be certain we're not walking into another trap? That ambush in the cemetery was too close for comfort." Holmes' eyes glinted in the dim glow of a gas lamp. "We are never certain, Watson, but certainty is a luxury we cannot afford. The syndicate's moves are calculated, their information too precise. They know our steps before we take them. That suggests a leak, and I intend to find it." They turned into a narrow alley, where the air grew colder and the fog thicker. Their destination was a discreet meeting with Inspector Lestrade at a nondescript public house, the Black Boar tucked away in a corner of Whitechapel where even the police rarely ventured. Lestrade had agreed to meet them after Holmes sent an urgent message, hinting at a breakthrough in the case. But Holmes had another purpose, to test a theory that had been gnawing at him since the cemetery ambush. The Black Boar was a squat, grimy establishment, its windows clouded with years of smoke and neglect. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale beer and unwashed bodies. The patrons, a mix of dock workers, petty thieves, and down-and-there-look merchants, paid little attention to the 2 newcomers. Holmes, with his keen eye, scanned the room, noting the exits, the faces, the subtle signs of tension or deceit. Watson followed, his hand resting lightly on the revolver in his coat pocket, a precaution he had taken to carrying since their encounter in the docks. Lestrade was already there, seated at a corner table with a pint of ale he hadn't touched. His ferret-like face was drawn, his eyes darting nervously as Holmes and Watson approached. "This better be worth my time, Holmes," he said, his voice gruff but tinged with unease. "I've got enough on my plate without traipsing through Whitechapel in the dead of night." Holmes slid into the seat opposite Lestrade, his movements precise and deliberate. "I assure you, Inspector, this is no idle errand. The Midnight Syndicate is planning something catastrophic, and we are running out of time to stop them. But first, I need your assistance in a matter of utmost delicacy." Lestrade raised an eyebrow, his fingers tapping the table. "Delicacy? That's not your usual style, Holmes. What's this about?" Holmes leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have reason to believe the syndicate has infiltrated Scotland Yard. Someone is feeding them information our movements, our plans. The ambush in the cemetery was no coincidence. They knew we were coming." Lestrade's face reddened, his moustache bristling. "That's a serious accusation, Holmes. You're saying one of my men is a traitor." "I'm saying it's possible," Holmes replied calmly, his eyes locked on Lestrade's. "And I intend to find out who. But I need your cooperation too." "Set a trap." Watson shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Holmes. He knew his friend's methods often involved deception, but accusing a member of Scotland Yard was bold, even for Holmes. "What's your plan, Holmes?" Watson asked, keeping his voice low. Holmes' lips curled into a faint smile. "We will feed false information to a select group of officers, including those who have been involved in our case. The syndicate's reaction will reveal the traitor. Inspector, I need you to summon 3 of your men to a briefing tomorrow morning. Include Constable Harroway among them." Lestrade's eyes narrowed. "Harroway. He's one of my best. Young, sharp, always. Volunteers for the tough jobs. You think he's the mole?" "I suspect everyone," Holmes said, his tone unyielding. "Harroway has been present at every major development in this case. His diligence is admirable, but it also places him in a position to observe and report. We will test him, along with 2 others you trust implicitly. Tell them we've uncovered the syndicate's headquarters and plan to raid it tomorrow night at a specific location. I'll provide the details." Lestrade hesitated, clearly uneasy about suspecting his own men. But he nodded. "All right, Holmes. I'll do it. But if you're wrong, this could ruin a good officer's career." "If I'm wrong, I'll take full responsibility," Holmes said. "But if I'm right, we'll have unmasked a dangerous conspirator." The meeting concluded, and Holmes and Watson stepped back into the foggy night. Watson's mind was racing. "Holmes, are you sure about this? Accusing a constable is one thing, but what if the leak is higher up? What if it's Lestrade himself?" Holmes chuckled softly, a rare sound in such tense circumstances. "An excellent question, Watson. I've considered it. Lestrade's bluster and occasional incompetence mask a fundamentally loyal man. But I'm not ruling anyone out. That's why the information I give him will be carefully controlled. If the syndicate acts on it, we'll know the source." They returned to 221B Baker Street, where Holmes spent the night poring over his notes, maps, and the cryptic symbols from the syndicate's ledger. Watson, exhausted but unable to sleep, watched his friend work. Holmes' intensity was almost palpable, his mind a machine of relentless precision. By dawn, he had prepared the full information, a supposed raid on a derelict warehouse in Limehouse, far from the syndicate's actual operations. The location was plausible but isolated, perfect for observing any reaction. The next morning, Lestrade gathered constables Harroway Mitchell and Brent in a cramped office at Scotland Yard. Holmes, posing as a civilian consultant, delivered the briefing with calculated vagueness, emphasizing the urgency of the raid without revealing too much. Harroway, a tall, wiry man with sharp features and an eager demeanor, listened intently, his eyes flickering with what Holmes later described as a shade too much curiosity. Mitchell and Brent, both seasoned officers, nodded dutifully but showed no unusual interest. As the day wore on, Holmes and Watson positioned themselves near the Limehouse warehouse, hidden in the shadows of a crumbling tenement. They watched, waited, and observed. The fog had lifted slightly, but the air remained damp and heavy, carrying the faint stench of the Thames. Hours passed, and Watson began to doubt the plan. "What if they don't take the bait, Holmes?" he whispered. "Then we've lost nothing." "But time," Holmes replied, his eyes fixed on the warehouse. "But I suspect they will. The syndicate is desperate to protect their plans, and a raid on their supposed headquarters would force their hand." Just before midnight, movement caught Holmes' eye. A group of cloaked figures approached the warehouse, moving with the cautious precision of trained operatives. Holmes' pulse quickened not with fear, but with the thrill of confirmation. "They've come," he murmured. "The trap is sprung." Watson gripped his revolver, his heart pounding. "How many are there? Can we handle them?" "5, by my count," Holmes said, his voice calm. "We won't engage unless necessary. Our goal is to observe and identify. Look there, by the door." One of the figures stepped forward, his face partially illuminated by a flickering lantern. It was Constable Haraway, his uniform replaced by a dark cloak, his expression one of grim determination. Holmes' eyes narrowed. "As I suspected," he said softly. "Haraway is our man." The group entered the warehouse, clearly expecting to find Holmes and his allies. Instead, they found an empty building, rigged with a few of Holmes' clever distractions, crates that toppled at the pull of a hidden wire, creating the illusion of an ambush. The syndicate members scattered, shouting orders, their plans disrupted. Holmes and Watson slipped away, their presence undetected, back at Baker Street. Holmes paced the sitting room, his mind racing. "Haraway's involvement explains much," he said. "He was at the warehouse in the docks, privy to our plans for the cemetery, and present when we discussed Baxter's disappearance. He's been feeding the syndicate every step of the way." Watson frowned, pouring himself a brandy to steady his nerves. But why? What could drive a man like Haraway to betray his oath? "Motives are varied, Watson," Holmes said, pausing by the fireplace. "Greed, blackmail, ideology, or perhaps he believes in the syndicate's cause. Whatever his reasons, we must act swiftly. He'll know we've deceived him, and that makes him dangerous." Holmes devised a plan to confront Haraway without alerting the syndicate. He sent a message to Lestrade, requesting Haraway's presence at a secluded location, an abandoned chapel in Spitalfield, Zunder, the pretense of an urgent being present. "If Haraway's a traitor, I want to see it with my own eyes," he said. The chapel was a crumbling relic, its stained glass windows shattered, its pews coated in dust. Holmes, Watson, and Lestrade arrived early, concealing themselves in the shadows. Haraway arrived precisely on time, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. He carried a lantern, its light casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Mr. Holmes," he called, his voice steady but tinged with suspicion. "Inspector Holmes St. Chapter 9. The midnight meeting. The fog hung low over London, a dense choking shroud that seemed to swallow the city whole. The gaslights flickered like weary sentinels, their dim glow barely piercing the miasma that clung to the cobblestones. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson moved silently through the narrow alleys of Whitechapel, their footsteps muffled by the damp air. Disguised as members of the Midnight Syndicate, they wore heavy cloaks, their faces partially obscured by wide-brimmed hats pulled low. Holmes had meticulously crafted their disguises, ensuring every detail from the worn boots to the subtle stains on their cuff, aligned with the syndicate's secretive operatives. Watson, though accustomed to Holmes' penchant for theatrics, felt the weight of the moment pressing against his chest. The air was thick with anticipation, and the revolver in his coat pocket offered only a fleeting sense of security. Holmes had deciphered the cryptic note found among Mr. Harrow's belongings, its symbols pointing to a derelict theatre in the heart of Whitechapel. The note had been a puzzle of alchemical sigils and coded phrases, but Holmes' keen mind had unraveled it, revealing the time and place of the syndicate's next clandestine meeting. Midnight, the old vicarage theatre, he had murmured, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the chase. Now, as they approached the crumbling facade of the theatre, its once grand marquee sagging under years of neglect, Watson couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into the lion's den. "Keep your wits about you, Watson," Holmes whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant clatter of a passing hansom cab. "The syndicate is no amateur cabal. They'll be watching for interlopers." Watson nodded, adjusting the brim of his hat. "And if they spot us?" Holmes' lips curled into a faint, mirthless smile. "Then we shall have to rely on our ingenuity and your marksmanship." The theatre loomed ahead, its windows boarded up, the paint peeling like dead skin. A faint light flickered from within, seeping through the cracks in the boards. Holmes gestured toward a side alley, where a rusted door hung ajar. They slipped inside, the hinges creaking faintly as they entered the musty interior. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and old wood, and the faint echo of their footsteps reverberated through the cavernous space. The old vicarage theatre had once been a jewel of London's cultural scene, hosting grand performances of Shakespeare and Marlowe. Now it was a hollow shell, its velvet curtains tattered, its seats covered in dust. Holmes led the way through the darkened corridors, his eyes scanning every shadow. Watson followed, his hand resting lightly on the revolver. They descended, a narrow staircase to the basement, where the syndicate's meeting was to take place. The faint murmur of voices grew louder as they approached, and Holmes raised a hand to signal caution. They reached a heavy wooden door, its surface scarred and splintered. Through a crack, they could see a dimly lit chamber, illuminated by flickering oil lamps. Cloaked figures stood in a loose circle, their faces hidden beneath hoods. At the center of the room stood a tall, imposing figure, their voice low and commanding. Holmes pressed his ear to the door, his expression intense as he listened. "The gala is our moment," the figure was saying. "The forged bonds must be delivered to the foreign investors without fail. Once they flood the market, the Bank of England will falter, and our influence will grow." Watson's heart sank. The plan to destabilize London's financial system was no mere rumor, it was unfolding before their eyes. He glanced at Holmes, whose eyes were narrowed, his mind clearly racing to catalogue every word. The speaker continued, their voice sharp with authority. "Lady Vaughan will oversee the exchange. Her presence at the gala ensures our legitimacy. The investors will suspect nothing until it's too late." Watson's breath caught. Lady Eleanor Vaughan, the socialite whose name had appeared in the torn ledger. Holmes had suspected her involvement, but this confirmed her as a key player in the syndicate's machinations. He leaned closer to Watson, his voice a mere breath. "We must observe her closely. She's the linchpin." The meeting continued, with the cloaked figures discussing logistics, safe houses, coded signals, and contingencies. Holmes memorized every detail, his mind a steel trap. Watson, meanwhile, struggled to keep his nerves steady. The syndicate's reach was vast, their plan meticulous. The thought of forged bonds flooding London's economy was chilling, and the stakes felt higher than ever. As the meeting drew to a close, the leader raised a hand, and the room fell silent. "The hour approaches," they intoned. "The Midnight Syndicate will usher in a new order. For the glory of the ancient ones." The phrase sent a shiver down Watson's spine. The occult undertones, first hinted at by Professor Langley, were no mere affectation. The syndicate's motives seemed to blend cold pragmatism with something far darker. Holmes' expression remained unreadable, but Watson knew his friend was piecing together the puzzle, connecting the alchemical symbols to this cryptic invocation. The figures began to disperse, filing out through a hidden passage at the far end of the chamber. Holmes and Watson retreated silently, slipping back into the shadows of the theatre. They moved quickly, their disguises holding as they navigated the labyrinthine corridors. Outside, the fog had thickened, cloaking them as they emerged into the night. "We've learned much, but we're not out of danger yet," Holmes said, his voice low. "Lady Vaughan is the key. Her role at the gala will be our chance to strike." Watson nodded, his mind racing. "But how do we get close to her? She'll be surrounded by her allies." Holmes' eyes gleamed with determination. "We attend the gala, Watson, as guests, not infiltrators. I have a plan." The days leading to the gala were a blur of preparation. Holmes, with his usual meticulousness, crafted new identities for himself and Watson. They would pose as wealthy investors from the continent, invited to the exclusive event at the Grand Royal Hall, where Lady Vaughan was to orchestrate the syndicate's scheme. Holmes procured forged invitations through his network of contacts, each detail flawless. Watson marveled at his friend's ability to navigate the underworld as easily as he did. London's high society. Holmes also spent hours studying Lady Vaughan's habits. Using his connections, he gathered intelligence on her movements, her associates, and her public persona. She was a widow of considerable wealth, known for her charm and philanthropy, but Holmes suspected her benevolence was a mask. "She's cunning," he told Watson. "Her influence stems not from wealth alone, but from her ability to manipulate those around her. We must be cautious." Watson, meanwhile, prepared for the physical demands of the mission. He cleaned and loaded his revolver, practiced his cover story, and studied the layout of the Grand Royal Hall. The gala would be a glittering affair, attended by London's elite, but beneath the chandeliers and champagne, a deadly game would unfold on the night of the gala. Holmes and Watson stood before a mirror in their Baker Street lodgings, adjusting their attire. Holmes wore a tailored suit, his hair slicked back, his demeanor that of a confident financier. Watson, though less comfortable in his role, looked the part of a prosperous merchant. "You look positively respectable, Watson," Holmes said, with a rare grin. "I feel like a fraud," Watson muttered, tugging at his collar. "Good," Holmes replied. "That's precisely the point." They arrived at the Grand Royal Hall in a hired carriage, their invitations granting them seamless entry. The hall was a vision of opulence, its marble floors gleaming, its walls adorned with gilt-framed portraits. The air was filled with the hum of conversation, the clink of glasses, and the strains of a string quartet. Watson scanned the crowd, noting the presence of several figures from the syndicate's ledger. The web of conspiracy was vast, and they were at its heart. Holmes' eyes locked onto Lady Eleanor Vaughan almost immediately. She stood at the center of the room, radiant in a gown of deep emerald, her auburn hair swept into an elegant chignon. She moved with effortless grace, her smile disarming as she greeted guests. But Holmes saw what others missed: the subtle glances she exchanged with certain individuals, the way her fingers lingered on a guest's arm, conveying a silent message. "She's signaling," Holmes whispered to Watson. "Watch her hands. The syndicate members are here, and she's directing them." Watson followed Holmes' gaze, noting the pattern. Lady Vaughan's gestures were subtle: a touch to her earring, a tilt of her fan, but they carried meaning. Holmes began to decipher the code, his mind racing as he catalogued each movement. "She's coordinating the delivery of the forged bonds," he murmured. "The investors are her targets." As the night progressed, Holmes and Watson mingled, their false identities holding under scrutiny. Watson played his role well, engaging. Ion was palpable, each moment bringing them closer to the syndicate's endgame. At one point, Lady Vaughan excused herself from the crowd, slipping through a side door into a private parlour. Holmes signalled to Watson, and they followed at a discreet distance. The parlour was dimly lit, its walls lined with bookshelves. Lady Vaughan stood before a group of 3 men, their faces unfamiliar but their postures tense. Holmes and Watson crouched behind a heavy curtain, listening. "The bonds are in place," Lady Vaughan said, her voice low. "The investors will take them tonight, and by dawn the market will be ours." One of the men, a wiry figure with a scar across his ch. Chapter 10. The Gala Infiltration. The fog that clung to London's streets seemed to thicken as Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson approached the grand edifice of Haverford Hall, a palatial venue nestled in the heart of Mayfair. The gala, a glittering affair hosted by the city's financial elite, was the perfect stage for the Midnight Syndicate's audacious scheme. The chandeliers within cast a warm, golden glow through the tall windows, spilling light onto the cobblestones below, where carriages lined up to disgorge their finely dressed occupants. The air buzzed with anticipation, the hum of voices and clinking glasses audible even from the street. For Holmes and Watson, this was no mere social event, which was the crucible where the syndicate's plot to flood London with forged bonds would either succeed or be thwarted. Holmes adjusted his tie, a subtle nod to the impeccable attire he had donned for the occasion. His black tailcoat, tailored to perfection, gave him the air of a wealthy financier, while Watson, in a similar ensemble, carried himself with the quiet dignity of a retired military man turned medical practitioner. Their invitations, procured through Mycroft's discreet influence, were flawless forgeries in their own right, a necessity to infiltrate the gala undetected. Holmes's sharp eyes scanned the crowd as they ascended the marble steps, noting the faces of bankers, industrialists, and foreign dignitaries, all potential pawns or players in the syndicate's game. "Keep your wits about you, Watson," Holmes murmured, his voice low as they passed through the arched entrance, where liveried footmen bowed deferentially. "Lady Eleanor Vaughan will be here, and she is no ordinary socialite. Her influence is a web, and we must find the threads she pulls tonight." Watson nodded, his hand instinctively brushing the revolver concealed beneath his coat. "Do you think she suspects we're onto her?" he asked, his tone betraying a trace of unease. "Not yet," Holmes replied, his gaze flicking to a group of laughing guests near a crystal fountain. "But the syndicate is cautious. They've evaded us thus far, and Lady Vaughan is their linchpin. She will be subtle, but her signals will betray her. Watch for gestures, small, deliberate movements." a fan raised at an odd angle, a glass tilted just so. She will communicate with her operatives in plain sight. The grand ballroom was a spectacle of opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen cascades of light, reflecting off polished mahogany floors. Tables draped in white linen bore silver platters of delicacies, oysters, on ice roasted pheasant, and delicate pastries that seemed more art than food. A string quartet played a lively waltz, and couples swirled across the dance floor, there, silks and satins shimmering in the candlelight. Yet, beneath the veneer of elegance, Holmes sensed a current of tension, a hidden rhythm that pulsed through the room. They moved through the crowd, Holmes's eyes darting from face to face, cataloguing details with the precision of a machine. He noted the nervous twitch of a banker's mustache, the overly tight grip of a diplomat's hand on his wineglass, the fleeting glance of a young woman in emerald silk toward a man in a corner. None of these were Lady Vaughan, but each was a piece of the puzzle, a clue to the syndicate's presence. There, Watson whispered, nudging Holmes subtly. Across the room, near a marble statue of Apollo, stood Lady Eleanor Vaughan. She was a vision in a gown of midnight blue, her auburn hair swept up in an elaborate chignon adorned with a single sapphire pin. Her presence commanded attention, yet there was a calculated restraint in her movements, as if every gesture were choreographed. She held a fan of black lace, its delicate movements seeming to punctuate her conversation with a portly gentleman in a velvet waistcoat. Holmes's lips curved into a faint smile. Well spotted, Watson. Observe her closely. The fan is her cipher. Note the angle at which she holds it, the rhythm of its flicks. She is signaling someone, but we must determine who. They positioned themselves near a buffet table, where Watson feigned interest in a tray of smoked salmon while Holmes leaned casually against a pillar, his eyes never leaving Lady Vaughan. The fan moved in precise arc stew, quick flicks upward. A pause, then a slow sweep to the left. Holmes's mind raced, decoding the pattern. It was not a standard cipher, but it bore similarities to naval flag signals, adapted for subtlety. The upward flicks likely indicated a number, the pause a delimiter, and the sweep a directive. He needed more data to crack it fully, but the intent was clear. She was issuing instructions. Watson, Holmes said under his breath, drift toward the east side of the ballroom. Look for anyone mirroring her gestures or responding with subtle cues. A nod, a raised glass, anything out of the ordinary. Watson nodded and moved off, weaving through the crowd with the ease of a man accustomed to navigating battlefields. Holmes remained where he was, his posture relaxed but his senses razor-sharp. Lady Vaughan's conversation with the portly gentleman ended, and she glided toward a group of foreign investors, her fan now closed and tucked against her wrist. The change in her demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. She was no longer signaling, but observing. Holmes followed her line of sight, noting a tall man with a scar on his left cheek, standing near a velvet curtain. The man's hand rested lightly on a cane, but his fingers tapped a rhythm that echoed the earlier flicks of Lady Vaughan's fan. Holmes's pulse quickened. The scarred man was one of her operatives, possibly a courier for the forged bonds. He needed to intercept him, but not yet any move now would alert Lady Vaughan and risk collapsing the entire operation. Instead, he drifted closer, pretending to admire a portrait on the wall while keeping the scarred man in his peripheral vision. The man's cane was no mere accessory. Its ornate head gleamed with a faint metallic sheen, suggesting a hidden compartment, a perfect vessel for smuggling documents. As the string quartet transitioned to a slower, more somber piece, Lady Vaughan moved again, this time toward a balcony overlooking the gardens. Holmes followed at a discreet distance, his steps silent. On the polished floor, the balcony was less crowded, offering a clearer view of her actions. She leaned against the balustrade, her fan opening once more. This time, the signals were faster, 3 flicks, a pause, then a sharp downward motion. Holmes's mind raced to interpret it. The number 3, a directive to act, perhaps a signal to deliver the bonds. He scanned the crowd below, searching for the recipient of her message. Near the garden entrance, a woman in a crimson gown adjusted her shawl in a manner that mirrored Lady Vaughan's fan movements. 3 quick adjustments, a pause, then a sharp tug. Holmes's eyes narrowed. The woman was another operative, likely, tasked with receiving the bonds from the scarred man and passing them to the foreign investors. Watson, Holmes hissed, catching his friend's eye as he returned from the east side of the ballroom. The woman in crimson, near the garden doors. She's part of it. Follow her, but don't engage. I'll stay on, Lady Vaughan. Watson nodded and slipped away, his movements unobtrusive yet purposeful. Holmes turned his attention back to the balcony, where Lady Vaughan was now speaking to a distinguished-looking man with a monocle, likely one of the investors. Her fan remained closed, but her posture suggested she was probing him, testing his reactions. Holmes edged closer, catching fragments of their conversation over the hum of the crowd. A most promising venture, Lady Vaughan was saying, her voice smooth as silk. The bonds are backed by the finest institutions. You'll find no better opportunity. The man with the monocle nodded eagerly, his eyes gleaming with greed. And the returns? You mentioned 12%. Guaranteed, she replied, her smile radiant yet predatory. My associates will provide the details shortly. Holmes's jaw tightened. The forged bonds were about to change hands, and the investors were none the wiser. He needed to act, but the timing had to be perfect. A premature move would allow Lady Vaughan to slip away, as she had done before. He glanced toward Watson, who was now near the garden doors, keeping a discreet eye on the woman in crimson. She had moved to a secluded corner where the scarred man approached her, his cane tapping lightly on the floor. Holmes's mind raced through his options. Confronting Lady Vaughan directly was risky. She was too cunning to be caught without evidence. Intercepting the scarred man or the woman in crimson might yield the bonds, but it could also alert the syndicate, allowing them to adapt their plan. The key was to let the transaction proceed just far enough to gather irrefutable proof, then strike. He moved toward the garden doors, keeping Lady Vaughan in his line of sight. The scarred man handed the woman in crimson a small, leather-bound packet, his movements swift and practiced. She tucked it into her shawl, her eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of trouble. Watson, positioned near a potted fern, gave Holmes a subtle nod, confirming he had seen the exchange. Holmes's heart pounded, not from fear but from the thrill of the chase. The pieces were falling into place, but the syndicate's web was intricate, and Lady Vaughan was its spider. He needed to anticipate her next move. As he watched, she excused herself from the monocled investor and moved toward a side door leading to a private salon. Holmes followed, his steps light, his senses attuned to every detail, the rustle of her gown, the faint scent of her perfume, the way her fan twitched as if itching to signal again. The salon was dimly lit, its walls lined with portraits of stern-faced aristocrats. Lady Vaughan stood near a fireplace, her back to the door, speaking in low tones to a man Holmes recognized as Lord Percival Grayson, a minor noble with a reputation for financial recklessness. Grayson's presence here was no coincidence. He was likely another pawn in the syndicate's game, perhaps a conduit for laundering the forged bonds. Holmes slipped into the room, concealing himself behind a heavy velvet curtain. He strained to hear their conversation, his mind cataloguing every word. "The investors are ready," Lady Vaughan said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The bonds will be distributed tonight, and by morning the market will be in chaos. You know your role, Percival." Grayson nodded, his hands trembling slightly. "And my debts? You promised they'd be cleared." "They will be," she replied, her tone icy, "but only if you deliver. Fail me, and the syndicate will not be forgiving." Holmes's mind raced. The plan was unfolding exactly as he had suspected, but the scale was staggering. The forged bonds, if circulated, would undermine trust in London's financial system, triggering a panic that could ripple across Europe. Lady Vaughan's role as the orchestrator was clear, but she was not the mastermind. Her reference to the syndicate suggested a higher authority, someone pulling her strings. He needed to act now, before the bonds left the gala. Stepping out from behind the curtain, he adopted the persona of a bumbling guest, swaying slightly as if inebriated. "Oh, I beg your pardon," he slurred, stumbling toward Lady Vaughan and Grayson. "I seem to have lost my way. Is this the way to the refreshment table?" Lady Vaughan's eyes narrowed, but her smile remained fixed. "You're quite lost, sir. The ballroom is that way." She gestured toward the door, her fan flicking once a signal, perhaps to an unseen ally. Holmes feigned embarrassment, bowing awkwardly. "My apologies, madam. I'll find my way." As he turned, he deliberately bumped into Grayson, his hand brushing the man's coat pocket. In that fleeting moment, he felt the edge of a folded documenta bond, perhaps, or a list of instructions. It was a risk, but he needed to confirm the evidence. Grayson flinched, his hand flying to his pocket. "Watch yourself, sir," he snapped, his voice betraying panic. Holmes raised his hands in mock surrender, backing toward the door. "Terribly sorry, old chap. Too much champagne, I fear." He slipped out of the salon, his heart racing. The document in Grayson's pocket was a lead, but he needed to regroup with Watson and intercept the woman in crimson before she passed the bonds to the investors. Outside, the gala was in full swing, the music louder, the laughter more raucous. Holmes scanned the crowd for Watson and spotted him near the garden doors, where the woman in crimson was now speaking to a group of foreign investors. The packet was no longer in her shawlet had been passed, likely to one of the men in the group. Holmes cursed under his breath. The syndicate was moving faster than he had anticipated. He caught Watson's eye and signaled for him to follow the investors while he returned to Lady Vaughan. She was back in the ballroom, her fan once again in motion, signaling to another operative, a wiry man in a waiter's uniform, carrying a tray of champagne flutes. Holmes's eyes followed the waiter as he moved toward a side exit, likely to deliver the bonds to another courier outside. Holmes's mind churned through the possibilities. The syndicate's operation was a machine, each part moving in concert. Lady Vaughan as the conductor, the scarred man and the woman in crimson as couriers, Grayson as a compromised intermediary, and the waiter as a final link in the chain. To dismantle it, he needed to sever the connections without alerting the others. He moved swiftly, intercepting the waiter just as he reached the side exit. "Pardon me," Holmes said, his tone authoritative. I believe you've dropped something. He pointed to the floor, where nothing lay, but the distraction was enough. As the waiter glanced down, Holmes deftly lifted a small envelope from the tray, concealing it in his sleeve. The waiter's eyes widened, but before he could react, Holmes melted back into the crowd, his heart pounding. The envelope was heavy, its contents likely the forged bonds. He needed to confirm it, but not here, not with Lady Vaughan's eyes scanning the room like a hawk's. He found Watson near the garden doors, where the investors were now dispersing, their faces flushed with excitement. "The bonds have been passed," Watson whispered. "I couldn't get close enough to see who took them." "No matter," Holmes replied, slipping the envelope into Watson's hand. "I have this. Find a quiet corner and examine it. If it's the bonds, we have our evidence. I'll keep Lady Vaughan occupied." Watson nodded and slipped away, while Holmes turned his attention back to the ballroom. Lady Vaughan was now on the dance floor, waltzing with a man in a military uniform. Her fan was tucked away, but her eyes were alert, scanning the room even as she smiled and laughed. Holmes knew she suspected something she was too sharp not to notice the ripples of disruption. He approached her, adopting the guise of a charming guest. "Lady Vaughan, might I have the honor of this dance?" he asked, bowing slightly. She hesitated, her eyes searching his face, but her smile never faltered. "Of course, sir," she replied, taking his hand. As they moved onto the dance floor, Holmes felt the weight of her scrutiny, her fingers tightening slightly on his. "You're not what you seem," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the music. "Who are you, really?" Holmes chuckled, spinning her gracefully. "Merely a man who enjoys a good waltz. But you, Lady Vaughan, are a woman of many talents. Your fan, for instance, such an elegant accessory, yet so expressive." Her eyes flickered, a hint of alarm breaking through her composure. "You're observant," she said, her tone light but guarded. "Most men don't notice such things." "Most men don't see what's right in front of them," Holmes replied, his voice low and deliberate. He leaned closer, as if sharing a confidence. "But I see you, Lady Vaughan. I see the signals, the couriers, the bonds. And I know what the Midnight Syndicate plans to do tonight." Her step faltered for a fraction of a second, but she recovered quickly, her smile tightening. "You're mistaken, sir. I'm merely a guest enjoying the evening." "Of course," Holmes said, his eyes locked on hers. "But the game is up. The bonds are in my possession, and your operatives are being watched. Tell me, who is the true master of the syndicate? It's not you, is it? You're too clever to be the one taking orders, yet you do." Her face paled, but she maintained her composure, her fan twitching in her hand. "You're bold," she whispered, "but you're out of your depth. Leave now, and you might walk away from this." Holmes smiled, guiding her through the final steps of the waltz. "I never walk away from a puzzle, Lady Vaughan, and you are a most intriguing one." As the music ended, she pulled away, her eyes blazing with a mix of fear and defiance. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice barely audible. Before Holmes could respond, she turned and slipped through the crowd, her gown a dark blur. As she headed toward the side exit, Holmes followed, his heart racing. She was making her escape, but she had left a clue, small, folded note that had fallen from her fan during their dance. He scooped it up, tucking it into his pocket as he pursued her. The note would have to wait. Lady Vaughan was the key, and he couldn't let her vanish into the night. Outside, the fog was thicker, swallowing the streetlights in a hazy glow. Lady Vaughan's figure was a shadow ahead, moving swiftly toward a waiting carriage. Holmes quickened his pace, but as he reached the street, a hand grabbed his arm. Watson, his face grim. "The envelope," Watson said, his voice urgent. "It's the bonds, Holmes. Dozens of them, perfectly forged. But there's more, a list of names, investors who've been bribed to circulate them. This goes deeper than we thought." Holmes nodded, his eyes fixed on the carriage as it began to move. "Lady Vaughan is escaping," he said. "We must follow her. She'll lead us to the syndicate's headquarters or to the one pulling her strings." They hailed a hansom cab, the driver urging his horse into the fog as they pursued the carriage. The note in Holmes's pocket burned like a coal, its contents a mystery that could unlock the final piece of the puzzle. As the cab rattled through the darkened streets, Holmes's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the conspiracy. Lady Vaughan was a formidable adversary, but she had underestimated him. The Midnight Syndicate's reign was nearing its end, and Holmes would see it through to the final with each passing minute. Lady Vaughan's carriage was a fleeting shadow, but Holmes's determination was unrelenting. He knew the stakes. Failure meant economic ruin, not just for London, but for the nation. The gala had been the syndicate's stage, but the real battle lay ahead, in the shadows where the truth awaited. As the cab sped on, Holmes unfolded the note, his